My daughter canceled my bank cards to protect me. Then I saw where the money went. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over a man when he is sitting alone at his kitchen table at 11 at night, looking at a bank screen on a laptop he was never supposed to still be able to open, and understanding one line at a time that the person robbing him is his own daughter. It isn't a loud feeling. I want you to know that first, because everyone expects it to be loud. They expect the old man to shout, to throw something, to pick up the phone and start a war. It wasn't like that for me. It was quiet, the way the shop got quiet after the press stopped for the night, when the last sheet had run and the ink was setting, and there was nothing left but the smell of it and the sound of my own breathing. That's the quiet I was sitting in. I had spent 50 years setting other people's words in metal and printing the truth for a whole town to read over its morning coffee, and there at my own table, in my own kitchen, I was reading the truest and ugliest thing I had ever printed in my life. Except I hadn't printed it. She had, line by line, transfer by transfer, in numbers. Her name is Sharon. She's my daughter, and I love her. And 3 months before that night, she had sat in the chair across from me, that same kitchen table, and taken my hands in hers and said, in the gentle, patient voice you'd use on a child or a spooked animal, "Dad, it's for your protection. Scammers are everywhere at your age. They target people like you. I've read about it. I can't sleep at night worrying about it. Let me just take this off your plate." And then she canceled my bank cards, all of them. And she moved my accounts under her care, which is a phrase she used more than once, like she'd practiced it, under her care, as if my life savings were a houseplant she'd agreed to water while I was away. She had the statements redirected to her address. She set me up with a little cash allowance, doled out weekly so I wouldn't get taken advantage of. And I thanked her. God help me. I sat there and I thanked my daughter for protecting me, because I had just buried my wife, and I was tired and lonely, and a man who is tired and lonely will hand over almost anything to the person who says the words, "I'll take care of it." But here is the thing Sharon didn't know, the thing that changed everything, the thing this whole story turns on. I still had online access to those accounts. She never knew. She had canceled the plastic cards, the physical ones, and she'd had the paper statement sent to her, because in her mind, her father was a doddering old man who can barely work the TV remote. She actually said that once to her husband, not knowing I could hear. And it never once occurred to her that I might sit down at a computer. But I'd computerized the billing at Halloran Press back in the 80s, before half the fancy shops in the city did. I did my own books online for 20 years. I knew my way around a bank screen better than she did. So while she was canceling cards and redirecting mail and telling the whole family how she'd gotten Dad's finances under control before some con man cleaned him out, I was quietly logging in, late at night, at my kitchen table and reading every line. And the money wasn't going to any scammer. There was no con man in Nigeria, no fake IRS agent, no sweetheart from the internet. The money was going to Sharon, to her mortgage, to her husband's truck payment, to a company I'd never heard of that turned out to be a shell she'd set up to bill me for care I was never given, to a cruise, the same month she'd told me, so sadly, that money was tight and she'd had to trim my grocery allowance because those scammers really did a number on your accounts before I stepped in, Dad. She told me I'd been scammed, and she was the scammer. She built a story about a thief to cover the fact that she was the thief. She cast her own father as a gullible, declining old fool being fleeced by strangers, told that story to her brother, to her neighbors, to anyone who'd listen. And the whole time, the strangers didn't exist. There was only her and her husband, and a laptop she didn't know I had. Now, I could have called her that night. I could have driven to her house and pounded on the door. A younger man would have, a hotter-blooded man would have. But I have spent my life in a trade that punishes you brutally for moving before you're ready. You set the type wrong, you print 1,000 ruined sheets. You run the press before the register's true, you waste a whole run. A printer learns, young, that the record is the only thing that outlives the argument, that shouting proves nothing, and a printed line proves everything. So, I didn't call her, I didn't drive over. I did the only thing 50 years at the composing stick had trained into my bones. I opened a fresh document, and I started keeping a record. Every transfer, every date, every dollar. I printed each screen and put it in a folder, the way I'd kept proofs my whole life, and I labeled the folder in my own neat hand. and I did not say one word to my daughter about what I knew. Because Sharon had made one mistake, and it was the same mistake her mother had warned me the wrong kind of person always makes. She had decided completely that I was finished. She looked at a grieving old printer in a too-quiet house, and she saw an easy mark, a soft target, a man who could barely work the TV remote. She never considered that the man across the table had spent half a century finding out where things really went, where the money went, where the bodies were buried, where a town's power actually sat versus where it pretended to. She never considered that she hadn't robbed a helpless old fool. She'd robbed a newspaperman's printer with a folder, a habit of documentation older than she was, and nothing left to lose. Before I tell you what I found when I really started following that trail, and it was so much worse than a cruise, so much colder than a truck payment, and it went all the way to a plan to have me declared incompetent and locked away so she could sell the shop out from under me. Let me ask you one small thing. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and how old you are, because I have a feeling some of you know that gentle voice. The "it's for your protection" voice. The "let me take that off your plate" voice. The voice that sounds like love and turns out to be a lock-clicking shut. And if you have ever had the strange, shameful feeling that the person appointed to protect you is the one you actually need protecting from, do an old printer a kindness and hit that like button and subscribe and stay with me. Because this is the story of what happens when the tired old man everyone has written off sits down at a computer he wasn't supposed to have and starts to read. Stay to the end. The end is the line she never saw me set. Let me promise you something up front, so you know what kind of story you're in. There's no shouting in this one. There's no scene where the old man finally loses his temper and says the thing that can't be unsaid. That isn't how a printer works, and it isn't how a printer wins. I won the way I fixed every hard job of my life, slowly in order, checking the register twice, keeping my hands steady when everyone was sure they'd started to shake, and remembering the one thing my daughter had forgotten, that the loudest person in the room is almost never the one holding the type. It's almost always the one most afraid you'll notice the drawer is empty. And I'll tell you one more thing up front, so you know what you're in for from an old printer. There's not even revenge in this, not the way people mean the word. Revenge is hot and hasty, and wants to hurt right now, and in the hurry, it nearly always cuts its own hands. What I did wasn't revenge, it was repair. I found a mechanism, my life, my family, that somebody had deliberately jammed so it would fail slow, and I did what I'd done for 50 years. I opened it up, I looked at what had been broken, I took out the parts that were put there to ruin me, and I set the whole thing running true again, so it would keep good time for the ones who come after. The person who jammed it answered for it, yes, but that was never the point. The point was that the machine run honest again. Hold on to that difference because it's everything. A man who chases revenge usually ends worse than he started. A man who sets out to repair, if he has the patience, ends with a machine that keeps true time and a young one at the bench. I wanted the second thing. I only ever wanted the second thing. To understand how I ended up robbed at my own kitchen table by my own child, you have to go back to the thing that hollowed me out enough for her to try it. You have to understand Ruth. The house was too quiet without her. That was the first thing, every single morning, before I was even all the way awake. The quiet. 51 years of marriage, and Ruth had filled every corner of our days with sound. The radio in the kitchen she argued with. The scratch of her pen doing the shop's books at this very table, Sunday nights, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. The way she hummed when she was concentrating, tuneless and happy. The way she'd holler up the stairs that supper was on, and I'd better not be fooling with that press past 6. For 51 years, I walked home from the shop and heard the sound of Ruth before I saw her, and I knew I was home. Then the cancer came. They told us on a Thursday in a bright little room with a water stain on the ceiling I stared at so I wouldn't have to watch her face. And it was neither quick nor kind, and over about a year, it took her from me a piece at a time. Until at the end there was just a machine breathing for her in a hospital room, and then not even that. And after, the house I had kept for a lifetime, the house full of the sound of her, went silent, and I moved through it like the last man left in a shut-down shop, walking past cold machines that used to roar. Grief does something strange to time, and you should hear this from a man who set the town's time in type for 50 years, who printed the church bulletins and the funeral programs and the wedding invitations, who marked the hours of a whole community in ink. Some mornings, I reached for her side of the bed before I was awake and found it cold and lost her again. Whole like the first day. Some mornings, I set 2 cups on the counter out of 51 years of habit and then stood there looking at the second one. I couldn't move her reading glasses off the nightstand, or her slippers from under the chair, or the little bottle of hand lotion on the windowsill that still smelled like her when I couldn't stand it anymore and opened the cap. People tell you the grief gets lighter. It doesn't. Your shoulders get wider, or they don't. And in those first months, my shoulders weren't wide yet, and my family measured that. Measured it the way I'd measure a sheet against the register. And made a decision. They decided that a man with a broken heart is a man who won't notice what's being carried out from under his nose. They decided the grief had made me soft and workable and slow. I'll give you one night so you understand the shape of the man they thought they were dealing with. It was maybe 3 months after the funeral, and I woke around 2 in the morning the way I did every night then, reaching for her side of the bed before I was awake and finding it cold and losing her again. And I couldn't get back to sleep, so I got up and went down to the kitchen in the dark, and without thinking, I set 2 cups on the counter. 2. 51 years of hands doing it on their own. And I stood there looking at that second cup for I don't know how long. And then I did something I'm not ashamed of, though I've never told a soul until now. I went to the closet where her coat still hung, and I put my face in it because it still smelled like her. And I stood in the dark holding my dead wife's coat, and I said out loud to the empty house, "I don't know how to do this, Ruth. I don't know how to be here without you." That was the man my daughter looked at and saw an opportunity. A man holding a coat in the dark. And I understand, in a cold way, why she thought it would work. A man that broken looks finished. What she didn't understand, because she'd never loved anybody that way, is that a man who's already lost the one thing he couldn't bear to lose has, underneath the breaking, run entirely out of fear. There was nothing left they could threaten me with. The worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened, in a bright room, with a water stain on the ceiling. Everything after that was just paperwork. They mistook a grieving man for a weak one. It's the most expensive mistake my daughter ever made. And for a little while, God forgive me, they were right. For a little while, I was so lost in missing Ruth that I let things slide I would never in my life have let slide. I stopped checking what I'd always checked. I signed where I was told to sign, or nearly. I let my daughter, in the fog of that grief, put her hands on things I'd kept my own hands on for 50 years. What none of them understood, because none of them had ever loved anybody the way I loved Ruth, is that a broken heart doesn't make you blind, not forever. Sometimes it's the very thing that finally clears your eyes. And there's a thing they never factored in. When you've already buried the one person you'd have died for, you run out of fear. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the house. They were looking at a poor, confused old widower in a silent house. The man sitting there, going quiet, going patient, going careful, was a man they should have been afraid of. Let me tell you about the shop, and about Ruth, because you can't understand what my daughter tried to take from me, unless you understand what it cost to build, and who really built it. Ruth and I started with nothing, and I mean that plainly. When we married, I had an apprenticeship half-finished under an old printer named Amos Deal, who'd taken me on at 14 and taught me the trade the hard way, with a smack on the back of the head when I pied a form and dumped a whole galley of type on the floor. I had ink under my nails and a head full of Amos's rules, and not 2 nickels to rub together. What I knew was type. I could set a line by hand faster than most men could write it. I could feel when a press was about to misbehave the way you feel weather coming in your knees. I could mix an ink to match anything a customer brought me. What I did not know was the first thing about keeping a business alive. Ruth knew. Ruth did the books at the kitchen table with a pencil and a tin box of erasers, and she was harder than any banker who ever looked down his nose at us. I did the work you could see. She did the work that kept the lights on. We called it Halloran Press, and for a long time it was just me and a second-hand platen press in a rented room off the square, me hunched over the composing stick from dawn to dark, and Ruth at the front counter and the ledger. There were years we ate a lot of suppers standing up at that counter because sitting down was time we couldn't spare. There was a winter I printed funeral programs for half the county for free, because the flu took a lot of people that year, and grieving families don't have money for grief. And I came home with $40 and a cough, and Ruth laughed and said, we were rich in a way the bank didn't know how to count. There was a stretch when a big account went under owing us more than we could afford to lose, and I sat at this table one night with my head in my hands, sure we were finished, and Ruth sat down beside me and put her hand on the back of my neck. She had a way of putting her hand on the back of my neck that held the whole world together, and she said, "Gene, you can make a dead press run again. You telling me you can't make a business run through one bad year? We'll make it run. Same as everything, slow and patient and together." And we made it run. We always made it run, and then it grew. The rented room became a real shop. With my name on the window in gold leaf I laid myself. And then came the work that made the name mean something. I got the contract to print the County Courier, the town paper. And for 30 years, the words this whole community read over breakfast came off my press, in my ink, set true, or the editor heard about it from me first. Halloran Press meant something around here. It meant the wedding invitations and the graduation announcements and the funeral cards and the ballots. I printed the town's ballots, think about that, and the church bulletins and the Little League programs and the 50th anniversary banners. When a family had news, good or bad, it came through my shop to be made real in print. For 50 years I held the town's words in my hands. For 50 years people trusted me to get it right, to spell the dead child's name correctly on the program, to not smudge the bride's mother's name, to print the truth in the paper even when somebody powerful would rather I didn't. And not once, not one single time did I betray that trust. That was my whole reputation, and my reputation was the whole shop, and the shop was Ruth and me, suppers standing up and all, for 51 years. Let me tell you about one job, because out of 50 years of them, it's the one that comes to mind when I think about what it means to hold another person's words in your hands. A woman came into the shop one morning, dressed neat, but with the careful look of somebody who'd counted the trip's worth twice. She set a folded piece of paper on the counter, and it was a poem. Her boy's poem, she said. Her son had written it years back, and her son was gone now, killed young, and this was the only thing of his. She had in his own handwriting, and she wanted it printed proper, on good paper, so it wouldn't fade and crumble the way the original was starting to. So she'd have something to frame and something to give his little sister when she was grown, and she was scared to leave it, you could see it. Scared some clumsy shop would lose it, or spill on it, or hand it back changed, because it wasn't paper to her. It was the last of her son's own hand. Somebody had told her, if anybody in this county can be trusted with it, it's old Halloran. I set that poem by hand, every letter, and I matched a paper as close to warm and permanent as I could find, and I proofed it 3 times, and I read it back against his handwriting twice more, because I would sooner have cut off a finger than misspell one word of a dead boy's poem. When she came back and saw it, clean and true and lasting, she cried at the counter, and she said it was like hearing his voice again. I didn't charge her. Ruth, who ran those books like a bank, never said a word about the ticket, because that was the trade. Not running ink, but keeping safe the words a person couldn't afford to lose twice. And the man who understood that about me, who understood what 50 years of that does to a person, could never have looked at me and seen only a building on a fashionable square. It took someone who'd never once kept anything safe for anybody to look at me and see nothing but a price. By the time Ruth got sick, we had built something solid, not rich. I'm careful with that word because it's exactly the poison that got into my daughter, but solid. The shop building, ours, bought after 30 years of renting, right on the square, worth a startling amount now that the square had gotten fashionable and young people paid real money to live downtown. The house paid off. The savings of a lifetime of honest work and Ruth's iron thrift. And the press itself, my presses, the old Platon I'd learned on and kept running out of pure love, and the good Heidelberg, and the cases of type, some of it 100 years old, wood type you can't buy anymore at any price. To Sharon later, all of that was a number, a building to be sold, a business to be liquidated, an old man to be moved out of the way. To me, it was a life. Hold on to that difference. It's the whole story. It takes a person who has never built anything to look at a built thing and see only what it would fetch. But before any of that, you need to meet my children. Ruth and I had 2 children, and I loved them the way you love your own, completely, and without ever quite seeing them clearly. Let me introduce them because both of them have a part in this, and the person standing between them has the biggest part of all. The older one is Sharon, my daughter. And I'll tell you about Sharon carefully, because her trouble was never that she was born cruel. Her trouble was that she was born wanting and never learned to stop. Even as a girl, whatever Sharon had, her eye was on the thing she didn't have. Some children are like that and they grow out of it. Sharon grew into it. She married young to a man named Wade, and Wade was a talker. A man always 3 months away from the deal that would finally set them up, and for 30 years the deal never came, and Sharon spent those 30 years watching other people have the life she'd decided she was owed. Bigger houses, nicer cars, vacations she posted pictures of, and then quietly put on credit. She wasn't a monster. She was worse in a way that's harder to see coming. She was a person who had convinced herself, all the way down, that she deserved more than she had, and that taking it wasn't stealing if she took it from someone who didn't really need it anymore. Like her father, in a silent house, with his heart broken. There was a moment, years before any of this, that I should have read for what it was, and didn't, because I still loved the girl I remembered. It was a Christmas, and Sharon had come with some new thing she wanted us all to admire. A watch, a bag, I don't even remember. Some expensive thing she held up like a trophy. And Josie, little then, had made me a present with her own hands. A bookmark she'd set and printed herself on the platen, crooked letters, ink a little heavy, my name on it, Halloran, that she'd picked out of the case one letter at a time. I held that bookmark like it was gold, because it was, and Sharon looked at it and laughed and said, "Honestly, Dad, you and your little machines. You could have bought a nice one for $2. You and your little machines." And I let it go, because it was Christmas. But Ruth heard it, and that night in bed she said something I turn over now all the time. She said, "You hear what your daughter did there, Jean? Josie gave you something worth everything and it cost nothing. And Sharon showed you something worth nothing that cost a lot. And Sharon can't tell the difference and never could. A person who thinks a thing's only worth what it cost, that person will one day look at everything you built and everything you love and see nothing but the price tag. Watch her." Ruth saw it before I did. "That man doesn't love our daughter's happiness," she'd said another time, gentler, watching Sharon and Wade drive off in a car they couldn't afford. "He loves the picture of it, and Sharon's the same. Keep your name on your papers, Jean." I told her she was being hard on the girl. She was right. She was always right. Her husband is Wade, my son-in-law. And I won't spend long on Wade, because Wade was never the engine of any of this. Wade was the passenger who never once asked where the car was going, as long as it was going somewhere with money in it. Wade had a small contracting business that was always underwater, a truck he couldn't afford, and a talent for being agreeable while other people did the hard, ugly work of getting him what he wanted. Whatever Sharon did, Wade benefited, and Wade smiled, and Wade did not ask. There's a kind of guilt in that too, the guilt of the man who eats the meal and never asks whose money bought it. But Wade wasn't the one who took my hands across this table and told me it was for my protection. That was Sharon. It was always Sharon. My second child is Michael, and here I have to tell you the part I'm least proud of, because this part is my fault. Michael was the quiet one, the steady one, the one who took after Ruth in the way that counts. He didn't want the shop, and I'll be honest, that stung me for years, the way it stings a man to build a thing with his name on it and have his son not want it. Michael went into the service, then into a good steady career, and he moved a long way off, out west, and raised his family there, and we talked on the phone, and it was always a little stiff, a little careful. Two men who love each other across a distance one of them helped make. And after Ruth died, when Michael tried to come closer, called more, offered to fly out, offered to help me sort through things, Sharon got in the way. Gently, reasonably, she told Michael that I was fragile, that too many people around me made me anxious, that I got confused and upset when he called, and it was really kinder if he let her handle things since she was right here on the ground. And she told me, in that same reasonable voice, a matching little set of lies about Michael, that he was busy, that he'd said he couldn't get away, that he'd told her he was happy to leave it all to her. She stood between my son and me and told each of us a version of the other that kept us apart, kept Michael far away and in the dark, kept the one person out of the room who loved me and wasn't afraid to look at the books. Because Michael would have looked. Michael would have seen it in a month. So Sharon kept him at arm's length, on purpose, with lies, the same way she kept me confused and grateful and small, and for the same reason. The scheme couldn't survive being looked at by someone who loved me and wasn't afraid to see. And then there's Josie, my granddaughter, Sharon and Wade's girl. She's 16, and Josie is the light in this whole story, the reason I can tell it without it being only dark. Josie is the one who started coming to the shop with me when she was little, the only one of the whole next generation who wanted to, and she'd stand on a milk crate at the California job case and set type with the tip of her tongue between her teeth, and the same stubborn focus her grandmother had. Josie has the hands, Josie has the patience. She has ink under her nails, and she's ashamed of her mother in the quiet, watchful way of a good kid stuck in a house that's going wrong. And she loves me, and I love her more than I know how to say. And everything I did, when the time came to do it, I did with one eye always on making sure that what was going to fall on Sharon never, ever fell on Josie. Hold on to her, too. Because in the end, the shop and the money and the building weren't the most important thing I had to protect. Josie was. And there's one last thing I have to tell you from before, because it turned out to be the most important thing in the whole story. More than the online access, more than the folder, more than any of it. And it was Ruth's doing. Years ago, long before she got sick, Ruth sat me down at this same kitchen table and made me do something that felt, at the time, like an excess of caution. She'd watched a cousin of hers get stripped to the bone by a son-in-law who talked his way into helping with the money, and Ruth had a rule, and she laid it out with her finger tapping the table the way she did when she meant it. The building stays in your name, Jean, the house, the savings, all of it, in your name, in a trust that only you control, and the real papers, the deed, the trust documents, the account originals, don't live in a drawer at the shop where anybody can get at them. They live in a safe deposit box, and only you can open it. You be as generous with those kids as your heart tells you. Help them, love them, give till it feels good. But your name stays on the papers, and the papers stay where only you can reach them. The day you sign over control is the day you find out what people really think of you, and by then it's too late. I've seen it, not in our family. And then she said, the thing I think about every single day now. She looked at me and she said, you of all people, Jean, a printer, you know better than anybody. Whoever controls the paper controls the story. Don't ever let somebody else control your paper. I thought she was being dramatic. I did it to make her happy. And Ruth, 2 years in the ground, saved everything I had with that conversation, because when my daughter made her move, she made it believing she was reaching for control she already basically had. I remember everything about that evening now, with the sharpness you only get looking back at the thing that turned out to be your salvation. The yellow light over the kitchen table, her tin box of erasers, the way she took off her reading glasses and pointed them at me the way she did when she wanted my whole attention, not the half of it that was still turning over a job in my head. Jean, she said, you are the best man I ever met at seeing what's wrong inside a small thing. And you are blind as a post about what's wrong inside the people you love. And someday that's going to cost you if you don't hear me now. And she didn't just make me promise with words. Ruth never trusted words, she trusted deeds. She made me get in the car that Saturday and drive to the bank with her, and together we opened the safe deposit box, and with her own hands, not mine, she put the papers in, the deed and the trust and the account originals, and she closed it, and she pressed the little key into my hand and said, this comes to you and nobody else. Not Sharon, not a son-in-law, not some lawyer one of them brings to the house. The day somebody asks you real sweet where you keep your papers, you remember this evening and you don't tell them. I laughed and told her she was talking like we were hiding treasure from pirates, and she didn't laugh. She looked at me and said, pirates always come dressed as family, Jean. It's the only costume that ever works. I thought she was being dramatic. I did it to make her happy. And Ruth, 2 years in the ground, saved everything I had with that conversation, because when my daughter made her move, she made it believing she was reaching for control she already basically had. She never knew, none of them ever knew, that Ruth had built me a fortress before she left, and that the only key to the gate was in my head, where you can't cancel it, and in a safe deposit box where Sharon couldn't reach. After Ruth died, Sharon moved in close, fast, and at the time, God help me, I was grateful for it. She started coming by every few days, then most days, to check on you, Dad, and she'd bring a casserole and fuss over the mail and cluck about how I was managing. And I was a wrung-out old man, alone in a house too quiet to breathe in, and I let that warmth in, the way a half-frozen man lets in a fire, never once asking myself why the fire had shown up now, after years of being banked so low. It started with concern, the way these things always start. Dad, you can't just leave the mail piling up. Let me sort it. Dad, you shouldn't be driving to the bank at your age. Give me your deposits, I'll run them. Dad, have you seen the news about these scams? They target widowers specifically. Did you know that? A man in the next county lost his whole retirement to somebody pretending to be his grandson. It makes me sick with worry about you. She worked that word, scam, like a chisel, a little deeper every visit. She'd bring printouts of news stories. She'd tell me about elderly people cleaned out by con men, sweetheart swindles, fake charities, the IRS imposters. She built a world in my kitchen where danger was everywhere and closing in, and where the only safe harbor was her. She was good at it. I'll give her that. Good the way a person is good at the one thing they've practiced their whole life, which in Sharon's case was getting other people to hand her what she wanted while thanking her for taking it. She never pushed. That was the craft of it. She'd plant a seed and let it grow in the dark of a lonely man's worry. I saw the saddest thing on the news, Dad. A man your age, a widower, lost everything. His kids didn't even know until it was gone. It just breaks my heart. I couldn't stand it if that were you. And she'd let that sit. And a week later, you know, I really don't like you having those cards in your wallet with all these scams. Anybody could get at them. And let that sit. Each visit another quarter turn on the screw, so gentle you couldn't feel it turning until the day she sat down and took my hands, and it seemed like the most natural, loving thing in the world for me to hand my whole life over to her, because she'd spent months building the exact frame in which handing it over looked like the only safe thing left to do. That's how it's really done, by the way, the ones who are good at it, not with a grab, with a slow, patient, loving hand on the small of your back, walking you gently toward the edge, telling you the whole way how much they worry about you falling. And then one afternoon, she sat down across from me and took my hands and did it. Dad, I've been talking to Wade, and I've been up at night about this, and I need you to just let me handle the money side of things. It's for your protection. You've been through so much, and these scammers, they can smell a man who's grieving. They really can. I want to cancel the cards and have everything come to me, and I'll set you up with cash for whatever you need. And that way, there's no way anybody can get at you. I'll take it off your plate. You've earned a rest from worrying. And she squeezed my hands, and her eyes were wet, and I want to be fair to her even now. I think some small, rotten part of her may have even believed she was being good. That's the thing about people like Sharon. They can perform the love so well they half fool themselves. But under it, under the wet eyes and the squeezed hands, was a woman who had already been to the bank, who had already looked at what I had, who had already decided, sitting in a house she couldn't afford next to a husband whose deal was never coming, that her grieving father was a resource, and that grief was the window, and that she had better climb through it before the window closed. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What else does a broken man say to his own daughter, with tears in her eyes, telling him she wants to keep him safe? I said thank you, Sharon. I let her cancel the cards. I let her redirect the statements. I let her set me up on an allowance, handed to me in cash on her visits, with a little note of what it was for, like I was a boy getting his lunch money, and I told myself it was love. And I told myself I was lucky to have a daughter who cared. And I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it's the part that snares the most of us, and there's no shame in it that shame should keep you from hearing it. I wasn't a fool for saying yes. Or if I was, it was the kind of fool grief makes of everybody sooner or later. When you are that tired and that alone, and that hollowed out, the person who says I'll take care of it isn't an accountant to you, isn't a risk to weigh. They're a warm coat in a cold room, and you put it on and you don't check the pockets. That's not stupidity. That's grief. And grief is not a character flaw. It's the tax you pay for having loved somebody. The mistake I made wasn't trusting my daughter. Trusting your children is the most natural thing in the world. It's how it's supposed to work. The mistake was letting the trust make me stop looking. Because trust and looking aren't opposites, whatever a swindler wants you to believe. You can love somebody with your whole heart and still keep your own eyes on your own money. And if there's one thing I'd shout from the rooftops to every tired, lonely old person in the country, it's that. Ruth knew it. Ruth said it at this table with her finger on the wood. I just needed to bury her and get Rob to finally hear it. And for a few weeks that's what it was, as far as I knew. until the cracks started to show, and they showed the way they always do with people like Sharon because the mask was never comfortable on her, and the second she believed she didn't need it anymore, she started letting it slip. It slipped in small ways first. The allowance got smaller, and the explanations got stranger. "Money's a little tight this month, Dad. The scammers really tangled up your accounts before I got them sorted. It's taking time to clean up." The visits got shorter, and the fussing got colder. She started talking about me in the third person while I was in the room, to Wade. The way you talk about a piece of furniture. He doesn't really keep track anymore. He's not up to that. I handle all that now. She'd catch me looking at a bill and pluck it out of my hands. "Don't worry about that, Dad. That's mine to worry about now." And once, standing in my own kitchen, not knowing I was on the back porch with the door cracked, I heard her say to Wade, with a little laugh, "Relax. He can barely work the TV remote. He's not going to figure anything out." He's not going to figure anything out. My daughter. In my kitchen. Bought, I would later learn, with my money. I stood very still on that porch, the porch where Ruth used to talk to her plants. And I did not move, and I did not make a sound, and something happened in me that I've thought about ever since. The grief came first, the way I told you. The understanding that the daughter I thought I had didn't exist. Another death in a year already full of them. But under the grief, cold and level, an old habit turned over. Because I had spent 50 years listening to people at a counter explain why the thing they wanted printed was true, and I had learned, bone deep, the sound of a person telling a story versus a person telling the truth. And through a cracked door, I had just heard my daughter tell a story. He can barely work the TV remote, and laugh at it. And the laugh was the thing, not the theft, the laugh. Because you don't laugh like that about somebody you're protecting. You laugh like that about a mark. I stood on that porch and I let the two of them believe the porch was empty, and I decided, right there in the cold, that the man who can barely work the TV remote was going to sit down at a computer that very night. And he did. I want to be honest with you about what that did to me, standing there on my own back porch. It didn't make me furious, not first. First it made me grieve all over again. Because in that one little laugh, I understood that the daughter I thought I had didn't exist and maybe never had. And that's a death too. And I'd already had my fill of those that year. But under the grief, cold and clear, something my whole life had built into me started to turn over, quiet, like a press catching. Because I had heard a great many people over 50 years explain to me why the thing they wanted printed was true. I had learned to hear the difference between a person telling the truth and a person telling a story. And my daughter in my kitchen was telling a story. I didn't know yet how big a story. But I knew, standing on that porch, that I had better find out. And that the first rule, the rule Ruth drilled into me, and the rule 50 years at the press had carved into my hands, was this: don't set a word of it in metal until you're sure. Get the proof first. Always get the proof first. So, one night after she'd gone, I sat down at the old laptop in the spare room, the one I'd used for the shop's books, the one Sharon had never given a second thought, because in her mind, her father and a computer were two things that didn't go together. And I logged into the accounts she'd put under her care. My hands weren't quite steady doing it. Part of me was still hoping, all the way down, that I was a suspicious old fool, that I'd open that screen and find nothing but my own money sitting where it belonged, and I could go to bed ashamed of myself for doubting my girl. That's the part of you that dies hardest, the part that keeps hoping the people who are robbing you aren't. That part died that night, one line at a time. I remember the sound the old laptop made waking up, that little chime, loud as a shout in the quiet house. I remember my own reflection faint in the screen before it brightened. An old man in a dark room, hunched, the way I'd hunched over the composing stick for 50 years. Except this time, the thing I was setting up to read was my own family. I typed in the login slow, 2 fingers, hoping I'd misremembered it, hoping it wouldn't take, hoping for a locked door that would let me keep my daughter a little longer. It took. It opened right up, same as it always had, because it had never once occurred to Sharon to change it. Why would you bother locking a door in front of a man who can barely work the TV remote? And there it all was, glowing, every account she'd put under her care, open to me like a book. I sat there a long moment with my hand on the mouse, and I understood that I was standing at a line, and that once I crossed it, I could never go back to not knowing, and I crossed it anyway, because I am a man who has spent his life needing to know where things really went, and I could no more leave that screen unread than I could leave a proof unchecked. And I read it, and it was all true, and it was worse than I'd feared. I want you to understand what it's like to read your own robbery in a bank statement, because it's a very particular thing, and it isn't like the movies. It's not a single dramatic number. It's the slow, sick accumulation of small ones, each one with a date and a plain little description, adding up to a story so clear that by the end, you can't unsee it. There was money moving out of my accounts and into hers on a regular schedule. Tidy, almost tidy enough to look like bookkeeping. There were payments going straight to a mortgage company. Not my mortgage, I don't have one. My house is paid off. And when I looked up the loan, it was Sharon's. There were payments to a truck loan, and the truck was Wade's. There were charges to a company I'd never heard of. Some little limited liability outfit with a bland name, $300 or $400 at a clip, regular, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what it was until later, when I learned my daughter had set it up herself, on paper, to provide care services to me, care I had never once received, so that draining me would look, on the books, like paying a legitimate bill. And there, in the middle of it, a big charge to a cruise line. A cruise. Booked, I checked the date. The very same month she'd sat in my kitchen and told me so sadly that she'd had to cut my grocery money because those awful scammers had left my accounts in such a state. I sat with that a long time, the house ticking around me. And I'll tell you the truth about what I felt, because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't rage, not first. First, there was that same cold, almost professional astonishment I used to feel, opening up a job somebody else had botched and finding they'd done it wrong on purpose, that somebody had taken care, had put in effort to make a thing come out crooked. She hadn't robbed me in a hot moment of desperation. She'd built this, set up a company, kept a schedule, told a cover story to the whole family, refined it, repeated it. This was a business, and I was the raw material. And she'd been running it since, I scrolled back, and my stomach dropped, since before her mother died. The first little test transfers, the first careful probes, started the week of Ruth's diagnosis. That Thursday. The bright room. The water stain on the ceiling. While I was learning to count my wife's breaths and dreading the day they'd stop, my daughter had looked at her mother's death sentence and heard a starting gun. She began that week, small, careful, testing. While her mother was dying and her father was breaking, Sharon was checking how much she could take and whether anyone would notice. That's a cold that goes deeper than hatred, and I had the proof of it glowing on a screen in front of me, in my own dead wife's careful column and row shape. Except my wife had kept those columns to keep us alive, and my daughter had kept them to bleed me. And here is where I did the thing that decided everything, and I want you to understand the discipline it took, because every cell in my body wanted to do the opposite. I did not call her. I did not confront her. I did not so much as change my voice the next time she came by, with her casserole and her cold little allowance. Instead, I became more exactly what she needed me to be. A little more confused, a little more grateful, a little more the doddering old man who can barely work the TV remote. And every night, after she'd gone, I logged back in and I documented. I printed each statement. I built a folder and then a second folder, labeled in my own neat hand, dates and amounts, the way I'd kept proofs and job records for 50 years. Because a printer knows the one thing my daughter had forgotten in her whole tidy little scheme. She was keeping her records to hide the theft. I was keeping mine to print it. And when the day came, only one of those records was going to survive contact with the truth. She was building a story. I was building the proof. And I have never in my life met a story that could stand up to the proof, once the proof was laid out clean on the table where everyone could read it. But documenting a robbery isn't the same as stopping one, and a folder full of printed statements doesn't save a man by itself. It bought me time, and it told me she was dangerous, but it didn't take her scheme apart. And in those weeks, while I fed the doddering old man act to my daughter by day and printed her sins by night, the part of my mind that had spent 50 years finding out where things really went finally started asking the question that grief and trust had kept me from asking for 2 years. The question was this: if Sharon has gone so far as to cancel my cards and cast me as a scam victim to the whole family, then she's near the end of some plan, not the start of one. People don't build a cover story about a con man they invented for the fun of it. They build it because they're about to do something that needs cover. So, what was the thing? What was she building toward? And how much had she already carried off while I was looking the other way, drowning? I didn't do anything rash. That's the first rule, and it's the rule that beats people like my daughter every time, because people like Sharon cannot wait, and people like me have all the patience in the world. I didn't confront her. I didn't tip my hand. Instead, on a morning she thought I was at the barber, I made a phone call I should have made 2 years earlier. I called Harriet Cole. Harriet was a lawyer, not some slick young thing, but a woman about my age who had done the real legal work for Ruth and me for 30 years. Quietly, out of a modest office over the hardware store. The kind of lawyer who reads every line and remembers everything and can't be charmed. I'd drifted from Harriet after Ruth died, drifted from everybody, and let the space fill up with Sharon and Sharon's people. Calling her back was like finding a good tool I'd thought I'd lost, still sharp, right where I'd left it. I told her everything, in order, plain, the way Ruth taught me to lay out anything that mattered. The canceled cards, the accounts under her care, the online access Sharon didn't know about, the transfers, the mortgage, the truck, the shell company, the cruise, the dates going back to the week of Ruth's diagnosis. Harriet was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I've turned over many times since. Jean, I'm going to tell you this as your lawyer and as your friend. What she's doing has a name. Several names, actually. Financial exploitation of an elder, theft, fraud, and if she's forged anything, forgery on top of it. That shell company alone could be enough. But that's not the part that worries me most. The part that worries me is the cover story. A person who's carefully telling everyone that you're being scammed and that you're slipping is a person building toward one thing, getting legal control of you. She'll want a power of attorney if she can talk you into signing one. And if she can't, or even if she can, she may go for a conservatorship. She'll try to have a court declare that you can't manage your own affairs and put herself in charge, legally, permanently. And the poor dad got scammed, poor dad is confused story you've been hearing. That's not gossip. That's her laying the groundwork for that petition. So, now you listen to me. And her voice went flat and hard and focused. The voice of a woman rolling up her sleeves for a fight she was made for. Don't sign anything. Don't let her see you're awake. Keep playing the confused old man she's counting on. And let me start pulling threads. But first tell me one thing, Jean, because everything turns on it. The shop, the house, the savings. Whose name are they in, and where are the real papers? And standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, I felt the whole mechanism turn over in the dark, tooth by tooth. In my name, I said. The building, the house, all of it. In a trust only I control. And the originals are in a safe deposit box only I can open. Ruth made me do it years ago. She said, keep my name on the papers. There was a silence on the line, and then I heard Harriet Cole let out a slow breath. Jean, she said quietly, your wife saved your life before she died, and you don't even know it yet. If the assets are in your name, and the originals are where only you can reach them, then your daughter can cancel every card you've got and hire every lawyer in the county, and she still can't take the shop, or the house, or the savings that are truly protected. She can only bleed the cash she can reach, which is bad and criminal, and will deal with it. And she can try to get you declared incompetent, so a court hands her the rest. And that we can stop. But we have to find out everything she's already done while you weren't watching. And we have to do it quietly, because the moment she realizes you're awake, she'll move faster than we can. I stood there in the ticking kitchen, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt something I'd thought had died, with Ruth turn over and catch inside me, like an old press finding its rhythm again, when you finally give it the right pull. All right, Harriet, I said, let's do it right. But I don't just want to stop her. I want the whole thing. The money, the plan, the cover story, all of it, laid out clean on a table in the light, where nobody can ever call it a confused old man's imagination. I spent 50 years printing the truth so a town could read it plain. I'd like to print this one, too. And Harriet Cole made a sound that was half a laugh and half something older and harder, and she said, Jean Halloran, I've been waiting 2 years for you to come back to yourself. Welcome back. Let's set it in type. Over the next weeks, I did 2 things at once, and doing them at once was the hardest thing I'd done since I buried Ruth. On the outside, I got weaker, softer, more agreeable, more ready to sign than ever. I gave my daughter exactly the surrender she was hungry to see. On the inside, with Harriet, I started building the team that would take her apart. But first I ran a test, because before you build anything, you check your register. And I needed to be certain. Really certain, not just certain because of a folder of statements, of what Sharon was. So, one evening, after supper, I gave her the smallest taste of what she wanted. I sighed, and I said, in the tiredest voice I owned, that I'd been thinking, and maybe she was right, that a man my age shouldn't be fussing with his own affairs, and maybe it was time I just let her handle everything, the accounts and the papers both, so I could stop worrying. And I watched my daughter's face open up like a cash drawer. "Dad," she said, warm as I'd heard her since Ruth, "I think that's such a smart decision. I really do. It's such a weight off, letting family carry the load. And you know what? I already have some paperwork ready. Just a power of attorney, nothing scary, so I can take care of things properly without having to bother you for a signature every time. It's just legal stuff, Dad. You don't need to read all of it. It's dry as dust. I'll show you where to sign, and we'll have it done in 5 minutes, and you'll never have to think about it again. You don't need to read all of it. I'll show you where to sign." There it was, in my daughter's warm voice. A general power of attorney to hand her control of everything, and an invitation to sign it without reading it. 50 years I held this town's words in my hands, made sure the smallest name was spelled right on a funeral program, printed the truth in the paper when powerful men wanted me not to. And here was my own daughter telling me not to bother reading, to just trust her, to sign. I have learned one thing about that sentence in 77 years, and it has never once failed me. An honest person begs you to read every line. They read it to you themselves. They make sure you understand what you're signing. A person with something to hide tells you not to trouble yourself. They want your hand on the pen and your head switched off. I had my answer, complete, and it set in me hard as a line locked up tight in the chase. "All right, Sharon," I said softly, giving her the beaten old man she wanted so badly. "When you've got it ready, bring it by. No rush. My eyes aren't what they were." And she told me she loved me. She'd started saying it again, now that I was useful. And I said it back, and then I went and sat at my composing table in the dark a while, because a man is allowed a few minutes to grieve the daughter he thought he had, even while he's getting ready to stop the one he's actually got. Then I built the team. Harriet brought in a forensic accountant, a sharp, unhurried woman named Dana Whitfield, who did this work for lawyers and courts and could make a bank statement confess. Through Harriet, I also reached an old friend of mine, Lorene Pace, who had worked at our bank for 30 years, and had known Ruth and me since before Sharon was born. Lorene couldn't break any rules for me, and I never asked her to, but I was the account holder, awake and asking questions. And there is a great deal an honest banker can do, inside the rules, once the real owner of an account walks in with his eyes open. And Harriet brought in one more man, on the recommendation of a prosecutor she trusted. An investigator named Marv Kessler, a retired cop who'd spent his last decade before his pension, working elder fraud, a heavy, tired-eyed man with a way of going quiet that made you want to fill the silence, which I imagine is exactly why he did it. The first time Marv and I sat down in Harriet's office over the hardware store with the blinds drawn, I told him I wanted all of it, the money, the plan, the cover story, the whole machine, and I slid a check across the table with the amount left blank. He looked at it, folded it once, put it in his pocket without writing a number, and said, "Mr. Halloran, before I take $1 off you, I'll talk plain, because you strike me as a man who'd rather have it straight. When a stranger does this, it's a case. I work it, I close it, I sleep fine. When it's family, it's a different animal, and winning it doesn't stop it from hurting. I've watched hard men come apart at the end of one of these, right when they ought to be celebrating, because what we dug up was worse than not knowing. So I have to ask you before we start, are you sure you want to see all of it, everything she's done?" I thought about the canceled cards and the cruise and the little laugh. He can barely work the TV remote. And I thought about Ruth with her finger on this table, telling me to keep my name on the papers. And I thought about Josie on a milk crate at the type case with her tongue between her teeth. And I said, "Mr. Kessler, my daughter cast me as the fool in a story about a scammer, so she could rob me and call it protection. I spent 50 years finding out where things really went and printing it plain for the whole town to read. No, I'm not afraid of what's inside my daughter. Open it up. Every line. He nodded, slow, and something behind those tired eyes sharpened, and he said, "Then give me a few weeks, and, Mr. Halloran, keep being the confused old man. It's the best tool we've got." And I kept being the confused old man all that spring, and I'll tell you plainly, it was the hardest thing in this whole story. Do you know what it costs a proud man to sit at his own table and be talked over and take it, with the truth sitting in a folder in the next room like a hot coal? To hear my daughter chuckle to a visitor about how dad doesn't keep track anymore and chuckle along, soft, like I couldn't follow it? To take an envelope of my own money handed to me like lunch money and say thank you? To watch Josie watch them shrink me and not be able to tell her yet why I was letting it happen? I bit through my own pride 100 times that spring. Do you want to know the hardest single moment? It wasn't the allowance or the third person or the chuckling to visitors. It was the evening she brought a friend by, a woman I'd never met, and she introduced me, in my own living room, as my dad. He's not really with it anymore since we lost Mom, but he's sweet. Anne patted my hand like you'd pat a dog, and the friend gave me that soft, pitying, sorry-for-you smile, and I sat there and I smiled back, vacant, agreeable, and let a stranger leave my house believing I was a hollowed-out old fool. And when they'd gone, I sat alone in the dark a long time. And I won't pretend it didn't cut me to the bone, because a man's dignity is the last thing he owns, and I was handing mine over by the fistful. But every time I wanted to break, to be the man I'd been for 50 years, I heard Ruth, slow and patient and together, and I thought of the difference between 6 months of swallowed pride and the whole rest of Josie's inheritance and my own good name, and I kept my face soft and my voice small. But every time I wanted to break, to snap, to be the man I'd been for 50 years, I heard Ruth, slow and patient and together, and I thought of the difference between 6 months of swallowed pride and the whole rest of Josie's inheritance and my own good name, and I kept my face soft and my voice small, because it's the patience of the pressman that wins these things. You don't force a tight form, you'll spring it and pie the whole job. You wait and you feel it, and you let every piece seat itself. And I had spent 50 years learning to stand still in front of something that wouldn't give, trusting that it was seating even when it looked like nothing was happening. Being underestimated never frightened me. It's the ground I built everything on, the ink-stained kid the fine men figured for a nobody. I let my daughter underestimate me right down to the last line. It was the most expensive performance of my life, and it bought me everything. It took Dana Whitfield and Marv Kessler and Lorene Pace the better part of 2 months to lay the whole machine out flat. And when they finally did, one Saturday in Harriet's office with the blinds drawn, it covered the table. Let me give it to you the way they gave it to me. In layers, each one worse than the last, because that's how betrayal really shows itself. Not all at once, but one floor at a time, each one dropping you further than you thought there was room to fall. The first layer was the money, and it was theft, plain and cold, dressed up in the coat of helping dad. Now, thanks to Ruth, the big prize, the shop, the building, the house, the protected savings, she'd never touched and couldn't, because it was in my name and locked where only I could reach. But the cash she could get at, she had bled with real method, and Dana had unrolled every thread of it. The transfers to Sharon's own account, regular as a paycheck. The payments to Sharon's mortgage. The payments to Wade's truck. The charges to the Shell LLC she'd set up to bill me for care that never happened. Dana had pulled the filing, and it was Sharon's name on it. Sharon's little company invented for the sole purpose of making my robbery look like a paid invoice. The cruise, restaurants, department stores, a whole second life, funded out of my accounts and my dead wife's thrift, doled out to me, meanwhile in cash envelopes, with the amounts shrinking and the excuses growing. It wasn't the fortune she was after. That was locked in Ruth's fortress. But it was theft, steady and deliberate, dollar after dollar, out of a grieving old man by the person who was supposed to protect him. And laid out flat on the table, in Dana Whitfield's neat columns, with the dates, it turned your stomach to look at. And then Dana came to the dates, and her voice got careful. The way a decent person's voice gets careful when they're about to hand you something that's going to hurt no matter how gently they set it down. Because the first movements, the first probes, the first test transfers off the account she'd wormed her way onto early, didn't start after Ruth died. They started before. They started the week of Ruth's diagnosis. That Thursday. The bright room, the water stain. That same week, while I was learning to count my wife's breaths, my daughter had looked at her mother's death sentence and seen a starting gun. She began that week, small, careful, a test. While her mother was dying and her father was breaking, Sharon was measuring how much she could take and whether anyone would notice. There is a cold in a person that runs deeper than any hatred, and I had the proof of it in front of me, dated in Dana Whitfield's careful hand, and it aged me 10 years in an afternoon. I sat with that a while. Nobody in the room said anything. They let me sit in it, and when I could talk, I said, "All right, that's the money, but the money was never really the point for her, was it? Show me the plan. Show me what she meant to do with me." And Marv Kessler, quiet in the corner, the way he knew how to be quiet, leaned forward, opened a second folder, and said, "This is where it gets bad, Mr. Halloran. Because she didn't just want your money, she wanted you, and she's already got most of the pieces in place to take you." The second layer was the plan, and this is where it stopped being simple greed and became a machine. A patient, ugly, step-by-step design to take everything I had and file me away. Marv laid it out in order. Sharon and Wade were underwater. Really underwater. The kind you can't see from the street. The house they couldn't afford. Wade's business always one bad month from the edge. The lifestyle propped up on credit, and now, increasingly, on me. And a resource that big, sitting in a grieving old man who can barely work the TV remote, was more than my daughter could leave alone. But the cash she could skim wasn't enough, and it wasn't safe. Every dollar she took was a dollar that could be traced, as she was about to learn. What she wanted was the whole thing, legally, permanently, with no more sneaking. And there was only one road to that, and she was already well down it. The plan had 3 moves, and Marv had documented all 3. First move, the power of attorney, the one she kept sliding in front of me, to hand her legal control of my affairs. But since she couldn't get me to sign it, I kept being too tired, too foggy, my eyes weren't up to it tonight. She'd started down the second, uglier road in parallel. Second move, a conservatorship, through a lawyer named Vic Sturgis, a slick operator who did this kind of elder work, Marv said, the way some lawyers do, accident work. Sharon was preparing to petition a court to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs and appoint her as my conservator. And to do that, she needed proof of my decline. That was what the whole cover story had been for. Every poor dad got scammed, every he doesn't keep track anymore, every chuckle to a visitor, every canceled card explained as protecting a man who couldn't protect himself. It was all evidence, being manufactured and seeded, for the day she stood in front of a judge and said, "My father cannot be trusted with his own money. Look how a scammer nearly cleaned him out. Look how confused he is. Put me in charge." She had even lined up a doctor, Pate, an acquaintance of Sturgis's, willing to write a soft, hedging note about cognitive concerns, based not on any real examination, but on what Sharon told him. A daughter feeding a compliant doctor a story about a father he'd barely met, so that a signature on a form could stand in for the truth. Third move, once the conservatorship was in hand, liquidate. Sell the shop building on the fashionable square. And Marv had found that Sturgis had already made a quiet inquiry to a developer. There was already a buyer sniffing. Sell the presses, the type, the whole trade, for scrap and salvage. Sell the house, and move me into a facility, paid for with my own money, wrapped in the language of love. He needs more care than we can give him. It's the kindest choice. It's what's best for Dad. The exact same language used to make more old people disappear than we will ever know. 3 moves. My money, my life's work, and me. I stopped a long while on that third move, the one that was about me, because it was the coldest of the 3. Marv had even found the name of the place. A facility out past the county line. Not a terrible place. One of the ones with the glossy brochure and a garden in the photographs. And he'd found that Sturgis had already requested information, costs and all, and that the costs had been figured against my accounts, the ones Sharon meant to control. Do you understand what that means? It means my daughter had already priced out the cost of putting me away, and already decided I'd pay for it, out of the money of my own life, while she sold my shop and my presses out from under me. She had planned my disappearance with the same care I'd give a fine job, and less feeling, and she'd have dressed it as love. Dad needs more care than we can give him. It's the hardest choice, but it's the right one. We're doing this because we love him. The very words, the identical words, that in this country every year send thousands of old people who were doing just fine into a room with a garden in the brochure, whose only crime was owning something somebody else wanted before their time. I sat there looking at the idea of that place, the garden in the photographs, and I thought, they've already chosen the room I'm meant to die in, and they've chosen it because they're certain I won't stop them. It changes a man, knowing a thing like that. It doesn't fill you with rage, not at first. It fills you with a clear, cold quiet, and the clear, cold quiet is far more useful than rage when there's a machine to take apart. And here is the beautiful thing. The thing I turned over in that room, like a piece I'd cut 50 years before and just rediscovered. The whole plan was impossible. Every move depended on things that could not happen. The power of attorney couldn't reach the fortress because the assets were in my name and the originals were where only I could reach. The conservatorship could only crack that fortress if a judge declared me incompetent, and I was not incompetent. I was sharp as a new blade, and now I knew it and could prove it. And the facility would be paid for with money they were never going to get. My daughter had built a 3-move machine to take everything. And not one of the 3 moves could work. And the reason was that a woman 2 years dead had sat me down at a kitchen table and made me keep my name on the papers. Sharon was throwing herself against a locked door, harder and crueler every month, right up to casting her own father as a scam victim in front of a judge, never once understanding that the door wasn't stuck. It was locked. And a printer had the key. I sat with that a long time in Harriet's office, and the more I looked at it, the more it had a kind of terrible, almost funny beauty. Picture it. A woman spends 2 years building the perfect theft. She studies the mark. She isolates him. She grinds him down. She sets up a company. She hires a lawyer, buys a doctor, seeds a story, finds a developer, lines up a facility, forges a signature. She builds the whole machine, piece by patient piece, sure of every gear, and she never once notices, not in 2 years, that the entire thing is spinning in empty air because the central part, the part the whole machine turns on, isn't there. She never had it. The key was never in the lock. My daughter had built a magnificent pick for a door that wasn't ajar, the way she believed, but bricked shut, with my name carved on every brick. Every dollar she skimmed, every paper Sturgis drew up, every comment about my memory she planted at a dinner. All of it work poured into a bucket with no bottom because Ruth, 15 years before, with her finger on the wood, had already closed the door and put the key where Sharon would never reach, in her husband's head, where you can't cancel it, and in a safe deposit box where a daughter couldn't follow. And the last thing that stays with me is this. While I was learning all of this, she was still out there, sure she'd nearly won, pushing harder and harder on a wall she believed was a door. There is nothing more dangerous than a person certain they are winning a game they've already lost. And there is nothing more useful to the one who's waiting. But Marv wasn't finished, and the last thing he put on the table was the thing that took the air out of the room, and it turned this from a family disgrace into a crime. Because Sharon and Sturgis, impatient with an old man who wouldn't sign, had decided not to wait. Marv had found 2 things. First, on at least one document already filed, my signature appeared. And I had never signed it. Forged, traced most likely off something real, but forged. And that is not a family squabble. That is a felony with my daughter's fingerprints on it. And second, there was the whole inverted poisonous heart of the thing. She had reported to the bank and to anyone who'd listen and soon to a court that her father had been the victim of fraud. She had filed me, on paper, as a scam victim, to explain the very money she herself had taken. She'd made me the fool in her story so completely that she'd put it in writing, and I want to sit on that a moment because it's the coldest, strangest thing in the whole affair. Think about what it takes. To rob your father, and then to cover the robbery, to report to the bank and the family, and soon a court that your father was robbed by a phantom, by a scammer you invented. She didn't just take my money. She tried to take the story of what happened to it, hand me a false one, and cast me as the victim of a crime that was hers. She needed me to be a fool so badly that she manufactured a fool and dressed me in it. And here's the part that chills me still. I think some rotten corner of her had come to believe it. People like Sharon tell the story so many times they move into it, until they can't say cleanly where the lie stops. I don't think my daughter could have told you by the end whether she was managing a decline or running a theft. That's not an excuse. It's the whole disease. A person who can rewrite the truth inside her own head to suit what she wants has no floor under her. Nothing she can't talk herself past. Which is exactly why the record matters. You can't argue a person like that out of her story. You lay the printed truth on the table beside it and let everyone read both. And Marv Kessler, 20 years on elder fraud, listed the crimes for me one by their right names. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, theft, fraud, forgery, and abuse of the very trust a family is built on. And then he said, "Mr. Halloran, this stopped being about getting your money back a while ago. These are crimes, several of them. I think it's time we brought in somebody with a badge." There was one more thing Marv found, and he brought it to me alone, without the others, because he was a decent man and he understood that some things have to land in private. It was about my son, about Michael, about why he'd stayed so far away, so long after his mother died. It hadn't been distance. It hadn't been the old careful stiffness between us, or a son simply busy with his own life 1,000 miles off. Marv had made some calls, to Lorene, to an old friend of Ruth's, to a cousin, and a picture came together. In the months after Ruth died, when Michael tried to come closer, tried to call more, offered to fly out and help me sort through everything, Sharon had headed him off, gently, reasonably, the way she did everything. She told Michael I was fragile, that visitors agitated me, that I got confused and angry, and it was really kinder to let her handle things since she was on the ground. And she told me a matching set of small lies about Michael, that he was busy, that he'd said he couldn't get away, that he was content to leave it all to her because it was easier for him. She'd stood between us and told each of us a version of the other that kept us apart, kept Michael far and in the dark, kept out of the room, the one person in this family with his mother's spine and no fear of looking at the books. Because Michael would have seen it. Michael would have read it in a month. So Sharon kept him away, on purpose, with lies, the same way she kept me small and confused, for the same reason. The scheme couldn't survive the eyes of someone who loved me and wasn't afraid to look. And then Marv laid down the last thing, and it was Sharon's own words. There were text messages. Marv had them through channels I didn't ask about, and the law later got its own proper way. Between Sharon and Wade, and between Sharon and a friend, and I am not going to read you all of them. I'll read you the one I carried folded in my shirt pocket over my heart for weeks after. Sharon wrote to Wade, "Relax, just keep telling everyone he got scammed and he's slipping. That's the story, and everybody already believes it. Sturgis says once the conservatorship goes through the shop, sells and we're finally clear. The account's basically mine already. He'll never figure it out. He can barely work the TV remote." And then the line that killed, in my head, whatever hope I had left about who my daughter was. She wrote, "Honestly, it's the least he could do after everything. He's had his life. The old man doesn't even know what he's got. He'd rather sit in that shop playing with his little machines than help his own family. This is me finally taking what should have been ours anyway. He got scammed and he's slipping. That's the story. The old man doesn't even know what he's got, in her own words, about a scammer she invented to cover the scam she was running, filing her own father as the fool. I looked at that a long time, and I'll tell you honestly what I felt, because it wasn't what you'd expect. First, God help me, I felt a terrible grief for the girl she'd been on a milk crate at the front counter once, 100 years ago, before whatever this was got into her. And then the grief burned off, clean and total, the way it burns now. And what was left underneath was the cold, clear thing, the Pressman's thing, the thing that had built a whole life out of nothing. And I said, all right, Ruth was right at this table 15 years ago. And now, Mr. Kessler, tell me one thing. My son, Michael. Do you have a number where I can reach him that doesn't go through his sister? And Marv Kessler looked at me a long moment with those tired eyes, and one corner of his mouth moved, and he said, I do, Mr. Halloran. And I said, then keep working. I've got a call to make to a son I let a liar keep from me. It's 2 years late. It's not going to be 2 years and a day. I called Michael that night. It was the hardest call I'd made since the one to the funeral home for Ruth, and in a way harder, because that call was about a loss already finished, and this one might tell me I'd lost my son too, through my own fault. He answered wary, that careful, stiff tone we'd both worn for years, and I didn't give him the speech I'd rehearsed. I just told him the truth, plain, the way Ruth taught me to lay out anything that mattered. I said, Michael, for 2 years I've been told you didn't want to be bothered with me, and I let myself be told it. because I was grieving and it was easier than fighting for you, and I was wrong. I've found out it wasn't true. Your sister told me one thing and told you another and kept us apart on purpose because she had her hands in things she couldn't let you see. They kept you away, son. You didn't abandon me. Somebody talked you out of the room, and I'm calling because I needed you to hear me say it before anything else. That I know now, and I'm sorry I ever doubted you, and I need my boy. There was a silence on the line so long I thought he'd hung up. And then I heard Michael, my steady, quiet Michael with his mother's eyes, start to cry. Not the crying of a man who's been insulted, but the deeper kind. The kind of a man who's been carrying a weight for 2 years and just felt somebody lift it. I thought you didn't want me, he said. She told me you got upset when I called. I stopped calling because I thought I was hurting you. Dad, I thought I was staying away for your sake. And that broke something loose in both of us, and we cried together, my engineer's son and I, 1,000 miles apart. And it was the true beginning of the mending. And then, because he's Ruth's boy to the bone, he wiped his face, and his voice changed, and he said, "Okay, tell me everything, from the start. And Dad, the papers. Please tell me you kept the papers." I told him about the trust, and the safe deposit box, and the shop in my name. And I heard my son, 2 years lost and 1 phone call found, start to put it all together in his head with the cool sequencing precision of a man who solves problems for a living, and I thought, they never should have let this one out of the room. Michael took a few days, and he came. He flew out and he came to help take it apart, not just to look at it. He had the mind for it. He sat down with Dana's columns and Marv's folders, and he ordered them like a schematic, found the connections, traced the money from account to account, saw where it landed, saw the shell company for the fraud. It was in about 10 minutes. "It's built decently, Dad," he said, tapping the way Sharon had moved the money. "Somebody helped her think about hiding it, but not well enough. Look here. Right here, she got sloppy. She got greedy, and she got fast. An engineer and a printer bent over the same pages, finding together the exact place where the person who'd written us both off had gotten careless. We worked late that first night he was home. At some point, the rest of the world was asleep, and it was just the two of us at the kitchen table. The same table where Ruth had done the books. The same table where she'd made me keep my name on the papers. The same table where Sharon had taken my hands and told me it was for my protection. With Dana's columns and Marv's folders spread under the yellow lamp and 2 cups of coffee gone cold. And at some point, Michael set down his pen and rubbed his face with both hands and said, not looking at me, "Dad, when I was young and I told you I didn't want the shop and you got that look, I've thought about that look for 30 years. I always figured you never forgave me for not wanting your trade. And I set down what I was holding because we were too old and had lost too much already to keep lying to each other. Michael," I said, "the fault was mine, not yours. I was scared. I'd built a thing with my name on it, and I was afraid it would die with me, and I mistook that fear for you rejecting me, and I pushed you off so I wouldn't have to look at it. You didn't turn your back on anything. You went and became the man you were supposed to be, which is exactly what a father should want, and I was too scared and too proud to see it. Your mother told me so every year. She said I was blind about my own children. She was right. It took me 2 years of grief and a robbery at my own table to open my eyes, but they're open. And the man sitting across from me tonight is the best son a father could ask for, and I don't deserve him, and I'm sorry." And Michael, my steady Michael, with his mother's eyes, reached his hand across all those papers and put it over mine, the way his mother used to, and neither of us said anything for a while, because some things don't need words, they just need a hand over yours at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, after too many years lost. And there was Josie. I have to tell you about a Saturday because it's the heart of why I did everything the way I did. Josie came by the shop, the way she still did when the house got too heavy. 16 years old and too big to be so quiet and watchful, a girl tiptoeing through her own home. And she picked up a composing stick out of old habit, the way some kids doodle, and started setting a line. And after a while, not looking at me, her fingers moving over the type, she said, "Grandpa, can I ask you something and you tell me the truth? Are Mom and Dad taking your money?" And I looked at that girl, my Josie, and I had a choice to make, and I made it the way I hope I made most of the ones that mattered. I didn't lie to her, but I didn't put a 16-year-old in the middle of a war with her own parents either. I said, "Josie, there are hard things the grown-ups have to sort out, and some of them are going to hurt, and I won't tell you they won't. But you need to hear the most important part, and you need to look at me while I say it." And she looked up, and I said, "None of this is yours to carry. You hear me? Whatever your mother has done, you don't inherit it. Not the fault, not the shame, none of it. You are your own person, and what you are is a good, honest kid with the best hands I've ever taught and more patience than your grandmother. And that's worth more than every dollar, every machine in this shop. Whatever happens to this family, you and I are solid. You'll always have a place with me, and a place at this bench for as long as you want it." And that watchful girl, who'd been holding herself together alone in a house going wrong longer than any kid should have to, set the stick down and put her arms around my neck, and I held my granddaughter in that shop and thanked Ruth and God that at least one thing in the next generation had come up straight and true. While I was quietly rebuilding my family and my record, my daughter was doing what impatient, frightened people always do when they think they've already won. She got careless. Overconfidence is the crack that brings the whole wall down, and Wade's debts and Sturgis's fees were leaning on her hard enough to open a wide one right down the middle. She took my after-supper surrender, "I'll let you handle everything, Sharon," as the green light she'd been waiting 2 years for, and she moved. The pressure to sign got heavier and more frequent. The power of attorney appeared on my table, and Sturgis himself came by once, a smooth man with a smile like a drawer sliding shut, to walk me through it in that patient, condescending voice. And I made my hands shake and asked slow, foggy questions, and finally set the pen down and said my eyes were swimming tonight. I'd do it over the weekend when my head was clear. I didn't want to make a mistake on something so important. And I watched my daughter work to keep the impatience off her face, close enough to taste it, the old fool who still wouldn't sign. So she pushed harder on the other track. Marv learned she'd had Sturgis move the conservatorship petition forward with Dr. Pate's soft note and the seeded cover story, and a date was coming. She was running for the finish line, and she stopped hiding the contempt now that she thought I was finished. That's the thing about people like my daughter. The mask was never comfortable, and the moment she believed she didn't need it, she took it clean off. She talked about me in the third person while I sat right there. She called the shop a building we really need to do something about. She talked about my presses like junk to be hauled off. At a dinner at her house, she introduced me to some man she wanted to impress as my father. He's not really with it since Mom passed. We take care of everything now. With a sad little smile, and the man gave me that pitying nod. And I smiled and shook his hand and thought about the deed to the floor we were all standing on, locked in a box with my name on it. She had already inherited, in her head. She was just waiting for the paper to catch up to what she'd decided was true. It never once occurred to her that the paper was a wall, and the wall was me, and I was about to let her run straight into it at full speed. Because while Sharon sprinted, I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work that actually wins these things. The work a person like my daughter never has the discipline to do. With Harriet, I drew up a new arrangement for everything I owned, a real one, read to me line by line the way an honest advisor does it, doing exactly what I wanted and shutting out exactly who I wanted. All of it built on the bedrock of the assets in my name that Sharon had never been able to touch. We made it ironclad, no gap for Sturgis to slip a finger into. I made a new will, a real one, with my friend reading me every word, which is precisely the thing my daughter had spent 2 years making sure never happened. And then I did the move that broke the heart of her whole plan. I went to a doctor, not Sturgis's compliant Dr. Pate, but a real one, a specialist Harriet trusted. And I sat for a full, honest, documented evaluation of my competence, my memory, my capacity to manage my own affairs. I spent hours answering questions, doing the tests, proving on the record, in black and white, with the signature of a specialist who couldn't be bought, that Gene Halloran was sharp, present, and entirely capable of running his own life. I built, in other words, the exact opposite of the file my daughter was assembling. She had a bought doctor's soft note and a seated rumor. I had an honest specialist and an evaluation that would hold up in any courtroom in the country. And with Marv and Harriet, I did the last, most serious thing. But before that, there was the quiet business of stopping the bleeding, and that I did with Lorene Pace at the bank on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And it was one of the most satisfying hours of the whole affair precisely because it looked like nothing at all. I walked into that branch. the same branch where Ruth and I had opened our first account with almost nothing 50 years before. An old man in a good coat. And I asked to speak to Lorene, and we sat in her little glass office, and I did the thing my daughter had been sure I could never do. I exercised the authority I had never actually given up. Because here was the truth Sharon had banked her whole scheme on and gotten exactly wrong. She had added herself to accounts, redirected statements, canceled cards. But the accounts were still mine. I was still the owner, and an owner who walks in awake, with his wits about him and his lawyer on call, can do a great deal. Quietly, within every rule, Lorene helped me move what could still be moved into a place my daughter couldn't reach, set alerts on the rest, and flag the shell company charges as the fraud they were, so that the very next time Sharon reached into the account, the hand came back empty, and she couldn't for the life of her understand why. I've thought about that moment often. Sharon, somewhere, checking, finding the tap dry, baffled, never once guessing that the doddering old man had simply walked into a bank and closed it. Lorene walked me out to the lobby after, and she stopped by the door and she looked at me, and this woman who'd known Ruth 40 years got a shine in her eyes and said, "She'd be so proud of you today, Jean, standing here doing this yourself." And I said, "She's the one doing it, Lorene. I'm just the hands." And with Marv and Harriet, I did the last, most serious thing. We took the whole machine, the stolen money, the shell company, the forged signature, the conservatorship scheme, the plan to sell the shop and file me away in a home on my own dime, the cover story that cast me as a scam victim, and we brought it to the people whose job it is. Adult Protective Services opened a file, and a detective in the Financial Crimes Unit, a sharp, unhurried woman named Grace Pruitt, who'd seen more of this than anyone should, spent weeks walking back through every date and document Dana and Marv had assembled, and by the end, she had what she needed. She had the theft, she had the forgery, she had the shell company, she had the fraud, and she had, cleanest of all, my daughter's own written words about a scam she'd invented to cover the one she was running. And, like everyone who came into this story, she had a certain quiet interest in being in the room when it all got said out loud. Everything was in place. The new arrangement, signed. The assets, ironclad. My competence, certified by an honest specialist. Michael, home. Lorene at the bank, ready to freeze and reverse what could still be caught. The evidence, complete and verified. The law, informed and waiting. All that was left was to choose the room and the moment. And I knew exactly the room. My daughter wanted my signature on that power of attorney at my own kitchen table. So I decided that my kitchen table, in my own house, was exactly where I'd give her my answer. I set the bait, and I made it out of the one thing my daughter could not resist. I picked a Sunday, and a few days before it, I told her I'd decided. I told her, in my smallest, most tired voice, that she'd been right all along, that I was ready to sign the power of attorney, ready to let her handle everything, the money and the papers both, so I could finally stop worrying. I told her I wanted to do it properly, all at once, and I wanted to do it as a family because family was what Ruth would have wanted. I asked her to bring Sturgis, so the legal part would be handled by someone who knew his business, and I added the piece that made it irresistible. I told her I'd asked Michael to come, so the whole family could be together. So nobody can ever say your old dad did anything behind anyone's back. I could hear the relief pour down the phone like water down a drain. Everything she wanted, wrapped up and delivered, the signature, the control, and her father asking for it, eager on a nice family Sunday. She wasn't even spooked by the idea of Michael. If anything, it pleased her, because Michael there to witness the old man signing of his own free will slammed the last door on any trouble down the road. "Dad," she said, and her voice was thick with something she mistook for warmth, and was really just the taste of the finish line. "That makes me so happy. It's the right thing. Mom would be proud of you. Mom would be proud of you." My daughter said that to me, greased to slide the grip smooth over everything I owned. "I'll have Sturgis bring everything. We'll make a nice dinner of it. It'll be good for everybody." Yes, it would be exactly that. She didn't know I'd be bringing guests to her nice dinner. She didn't know the table she'd set so carefully to take my life had already been booked, by me, quietly, for something else. Sunday came, clear and cold, with that hard March light Ruth loved because she said it showed you the truth of a thing with nowhere left to hide. I dressed with care. I put on the good suit, the one I wore for important customers and finished jobs and Ruth's funeral, and in my breast pocket, over my heart, I put a folded sheet of paper. I sat at my table, in my house, in the chair they had set for me, and I folded my hands, and I waited. I'd woken early that morning, before light, and lain there a while in the quiet, and I talked to Ruth. Not out of loneliness that morning, but out of readiness. I told her it was the day. I told her I'd kept my name on the papers, the way she made me promise, and that today she was going to win through me, and that I only needed to keep my hand steady a few more hours. And I swear I felt her hand on the back of my neck, the one that held the whole world together, even though it wasn't there. Then I got up and made the coffee and stood at the counter drinking it in the gray light, and I was not afraid. I felt the way I used to feel the morning of a hard job I knew I was ready for. Register true, ink mixed, paper stacked, nothing left but to pull the lever and let the press do what a lifetime had built it to do. A pressman knows how to wait. It was the last thing I'd relearned that spring. It was the first thing I ever learned at 14, with Amos rapping my knuckles. Wait until every piece is seated, not 1 second before. Sharon was in fine spirits. I'd rarely seen her so loose, so warm. She kept touching my shoulder as she passed, calling me Dad, telling me what a good decision I was making. She'd made the dinner and set the table with the good dishes. The host set the carving up of her own father. Sturgis arrived with a leather folder and a smile like a drawer sliding shut, and shook my hand and told me I was doing the responsible thing. And I said, I surely hope so. He laid the documents out at my place, squared them up neat, set a good pen beside them, and pulled my chair out for me, like I was the guest of honor, which in a way I was. And then the doorbell rang, and it was Michael, and Sharon went to let him in, all smiles, the good sister, with no idea in the world that she'd just opened her own front door to the start of the end. Before we begin, I said, once everyone was seated and the dinner was served and Sturgis had his folder open, I asked a couple more people to join us. I hope nobody minds. They should be right outside. Sharon's smile flickered. Dad, it's a family dinner. We don't need... It's my signature, Sharon, I said, quietly, gently. The first sentence I'd spoken in that house in 2 years, with iron in it, and it landed like iron, and I watched her feel it. I'd like them to come in. And the door opened. They came in one at a time, and I watched my daughter's nice dinner come apart with every face that crossed the threshold. First Harriet Cole, my lawyer and friend of 30 years, with a thick folder. And Sturgis's smile tightened, because he knew a lot of lawyers, and he did not know this one, and a lawyer he didn't control was in nobody's plan. Then Dana Whitfield with her binder, and old Lorene Pace from the bank, who had known Ruth and me since before Sharon was born, and who looked at my daughter with an expression that would strip paint. Then Marv Kessler with his tired, patient eyes. And behind him, and here Sharon actually rose halfway out of her chair, Detective Grace Pruitt in a plain jacket with her badge clipped where everyone could see it, and beside her, a woman from Adult Protective Services with a folder of her own. And last, my son Michael, who had flown home not to watch me sign my life away, but to help me take it back, standing there beside his mother's old friends, with his mother's spine and his mother's eyes, looking at his sister. What is this? Sharon said. It wasn't a question. All the warmth was gone, and the room had dropped into that held-breath silence. Except this time, it wasn't falling on me. This time, it was falling on her. Sit down, Sharon, I said, quietly. I have never in my life needed to raise my voice to be heard, and I didn't raise it then. We're going to have the dinner, just not the one you planned. Sit down, and let me set a few things out for everyone. It's what I do. I looked around the room a moment before I began. My table, laid with the good dishes by my own daughter for my undoing. Sturgis's leather folder, open, the power of attorney waiting for my signature. The good pen set beside it. The real guests and the guests my daughter hadn't invited, standing along the wall like a formway coming back into square. And I thought of Ruth, who would have wanted to see this, and who, in a way, was seeing it, because every bit of what was about to happen, she had made possible 15 years before, with her finger on the wood. And I thought, here we are, love, at our table. Let's watch together what happens when a person finds out at last what her father is made of. And there was a moment, I'll remember it always, where I watched my daughter look at the door, the documents, Sturgis, the detective, and calculate, the way she always calculated, hunting for the angle, the smile, the reasonable thing to say that had gotten her out of everything her whole life, and she didn't find one, and she sat down. "Harriet," I said, "you start with the shop, and the house. Whose name are they in?" And Harriet Cole opened her folder, and in a flat, clear voice with no mercy in it, began to read. She read the trust. She read the deed to the shop building on the square. She read, in plain words that filled the room and could not be unheard, the thing my daughter had spent 2 years never thinking to check, that all of it, the building worth a startling amount, the house, the protected savings, was in the name of Jean Halloran and no one else, and could not be sold, mortgaged, or touched by anyone but me. I watched it land on my daughter. I watched her understand finally that the wall she'd been throwing herself against for 2 years, crueler and more frantic every month, had a name. And the name was her father, sitting quietly at the head of the table the whole time. And I watched her understand that the conservatorship, the whole parallel track, the bought doctor, the seeded story, the forged signature, had only ever been for one thing: to declare the one man who could sign incompetent, because there was no other way around that wall. Sturgis had gone very still. Somewhere in the middle of Harriet's reading, Sharon found her voice, because people like my daughter always try one more angle even as the floor gives way. "This is ridiculous," she said, going for the warm, reasonable tone, the one that had worked her whole life. "Dad's confused. He doesn't understand what he's signed over the years. He gets things mixed up. Michael, tell them. You know how he's been since Mom?" And that's as far as she got, because Michael, my quiet son, who hadn't said a word since he came through the door, spoke, and his voice was very low and very even. The most dangerous a gentleman ever gets. "How he's been since Mom," Michael said. "You mean since Mom's diagnosis, Sharon? The week you started moving his money? I've got the dates in front of me. You want to talk about since Mom?" And my daughter looked at her brother, the brother she'd lied out of the room for 2 years, thinking he'd never be in it. And whatever she'd been about to say died in her throat, because she finally understood that the one person she'd worked hardest to keep away was sitting right there, and he'd read every page, and he was not confused about anything. She'd built her whole plan on nobody who loved me ever being allowed to look at the books. And there sat Michael, who loved me, looking at the books. She had no angle left. She went quiet. Harriet kept reading. "Now the money," I said. "Dana." And Dana Whitfield stood and, in her cool, unhurried way, read the theft. She read the transfers to Sharon's account. She read the payments to Sharon's mortgage and Wade's truck. She read the shell company and held up the filing with Sharon's name on it, the little business invented to make a robbery look like a bill. She read the cruise, and she read the dates. And when she said the date the first transfers began, the week of Ruth's diagnosis, I saw Michael's hand go to his mouth, and I saw him turn slowly to look at his sister. And there was something on his face I'd never seen there, because Michael is a gentleman. But in that moment, he understood that while he and I sat counting his mother's breaths, this woman had been counting her mother's money. Wade had gone gray. Sharon had stopped breathing. Dana never raised her voice. Every number was a nail, and she drove them all in with the calm of someone who doesn't need to swing hard because the hammer is the truth, and the truth sinks in on its own. Then Lorene Pace spoke, plain and furious and quiet, about the pattern the bank had seen. A daughter who canceled a widower's cards and redirected his mail and moved his money to herself, and then reported him to the bank's own fraud line as a victim of a scammer to paper over where the money had really gone. "I've worked at that bank 30 years, Lorene said, looking straight at Sharon. "I've seen a lot of ways to steal from an old person. I'd never yet seen somebody rob her own father and then file him as the victim to cover it. That's a new low, Sharon, and I knew your mother." And then Marv Kessler laid 2 things on the table. The first was Dr. Pate's soft, hedging note about my cognitive concerns. And beside it, the honest specialist's evaluation, the real one, certifying in black and white that Jean Halloran was fully competent. "Your conservatorship petition rests on that first note," Marv said to Sturgis. "You want to explain to Detective Pruitt what examination it's based on? Or should we talk about how Dr. Pate came to sign it?" And the second thing Marv laid down was the forged document. My signature on a paper I had never signed. "And this," Marv said, "is a signature Mr. Halloran never wrote. Forgery is not a family disagreement, counselor. It's a felony, one somebody at this table committed." Sturgis did what men like Sturgis always do the second the badge is real and the paper is on the table. He tried to save himself by throwing everyone else in. "I drafted documents on my client's instructions," he said quickly, hands up, already half turned toward the detective. "The conservatorship was her idea. I knew nothing about any forgery. I never saw the bank activity, doctor." Pate's note came through her. "Shut up, Vic," Sharon said. And there it was at last, the real voice, the real face, the thing that had always been under the warmth, out now in that hard March light with nowhere left to hide. And then I did the last thing, the one that was mine to do, because it was the deepest cut, and a father has to hand some things over himself. I reached into my breast pocket, over my heart, and took out the folded sheet of paper, and I opened it, and I laid it flat on the table. It was the text message, my daughter's own words, the ones I'd carried folded over my heart for weeks. And I didn't read all of it. I read the part I'd carried. I read in my plain, steady voice to the whole table. "Just keep telling everyone he got scammed and he's slipping. That's the story, and everybody already believes it. The account's basically mine already. He'll never figure it out. He can barely work the TV remote." And then I read the last of it, looking at my daughter, not the paper, because I knew it by heart. "The old man doesn't even know what he's got. This is me finally taking what should have been ours anyway." I set the paper down, and the room was so quiet you could hear the old clock on the sideboard, the one I'd kept wound since Ruth died, ticking true. "You told me scammers were everywhere at my age, Sharon," I said into that quiet. "You said it to my face, right here at this table, when you took my cards, and you were right, there was a scammer. I just had the address wrong." And then the thing happened that always happens, the thing I'd counted on from the start, the thing greed does to the people who share it. The second the law was plainly in the room and the proof was plainly on the table, my daughter's alliance came apart in seconds, because there is no loyalty among people who were only ever in it for themselves. There's just the cold arithmetic of who goes down worse if they don't sell the others first, and faster. Sturgis was already talking, already offering his files, already a witness for the other side, and Wade, my son-in-law, the passenger who never asked where the car was going, Wade stared at that text message on the table, and at the detective, and something in his soft, agreeable face finally cracked. "Sharon," he said, and his voice was shaking, you told me it was legal. You said he wanted us to have it. You said the lawyer said it was fine. You said he got scammed. Sharon, did you write that? Did you take his cards and then?" "Wade, don't you dare," Sharon hissed. But he was already coming apart, already turning toward the detective with the wild look of a man who's just seen how far down the floor really is. And I understood that Wade had told himself the same soft story for 2 years that let him eat the meal and never ask whose money bought it. And now the check had come, and he could not pay it, and he was going to do the only thing left, which was hand her over to keep from drowning himself. The whole rotten alliance came down around that table in about a minute, everybody grabbing for whoever they could reach to keep their own head above water, and I sat and watched it, quiet, the way you watch a cheap lock finally give and spill its pins. Sharon sat in the wreck of her nice dinner and did the only thing she had left. She turned to me, and the tears came fast and easy, the way they could when she needed them, and she said, "Dad, Daddy, please." I was desperate. You don't know the pressure we were under. Wade's business, the house. I made mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. I'm your daughter. Whatever happens here, I'm still your daughter. Daddy, please. And she reached her hand across the table toward me, and the whole room held its breath to see what the old man would do. I didn't take her hand, but I didn't shout either, and I want you to understand that this was the most important thing I did in that room. My daughter wanted a scene. She wanted the old man's rage, something loud and ugly she could point to afterward, so she could tell herself and everyone else that this was just a family coming apart, a hard old man and a desperate daughter, and not what it actually was, a careful theft finally dragged into the light. I didn't give it to her. I gave her the truth instead, in the plainest voice I own. "You canceled my cards," I said, "and told me it was to protect me from thieves. And the thief was you. You told the whole family I'd been scammed, so nobody would look at where the money went. And you cast your own father as a gullible old fool to cover the fact that you were robbing him. I've spent weeks asking myself why, and I finally understand it. You did it because you were completely sure you'd already won. You were sure the old man was finished and confused and done, and you didn't have to pretend anymore. But you never had it, Sharon. Not for one single day. Your mother saw to that at this table 15 years ago because she looked at what wanting had done to you even then, and she protected the rest of us from it. Everything you tried to take from people who trusted you, from a brother you lied out of the room, from a father who was burying your mother the week you started counting his money. This is the harvest, Sharon. A person reaps what they plant, and it's the oldest law there is, and you planted nothing your whole life but wanting. I didn't do this to you. You did it to yourself. I'm only the printer who finally stopped pretending the drawer was jammed and admitted it was locked. Anne remembered he had the key. She had nothing to say to that. For the first time in her whole smooth, wanting life, my daughter opened her mouth and found nothing in it. Detective Pruitt stepped in then, quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it heavier and not lighter. There were things in the hour that followed. I won't dress up for you. Sturgis answering for his documents, Dr. Pate's name going into the record, Wade talking fast to the detective, my daughter answering for the theft, the forgery, the shell company, the fraud, the careful machinery of the law beginning to turn against the people who'd built a machine to grind me down. I'll spare you the procedure. What I'll tell you is that at a certain point, in the middle of it, I got up from that table and went to find Josie. Because Josie was in the house. Of course she was. It was Sunday. She was upstairs, and she'd come partway down when the voices rose. And now she sat on the landing, 16 years old, watching her family come apart at the bottom of the stairs, her face white, her arms wrapped around her knees. And I climbed those stairs, these old knees and all, and I sat down next to my granddaughter on the landing, and I put my arm around her and I said, I've got you. Whatever happens down there, you hear me? I've got you, and none of this is yours, and you and I are solid as a locked-up form. And she turned her face into my shoulder and cried, and I held her. And down below the law did its work, and I stayed on the stairs with the one thing in that house I'd set out to protect from the very beginning. And I let the rest happen without me. Some things matter more than being in the room when the trap springs. A scared 16-year-old on a landing mattered more than watching my daughter answer for herself. I have never once been sorry I chose the stairs. I've thought since about why that felt so clear, in a moment when everything downstairs was the thing I'd worked half a year to bring about. And it's this. The whole point of all of it, the folder, the patience, the trap, was never to watch my daughter go down. It was to keep something safe. And the most important thing I had to keep safe was never the shop or the money. It was a good kid who didn't ask to be born into a house that was going wrong. Down at the bottom of the stairs, the law could handle the machine my daughter built. Up on the landing, there was a scared girl who needed her grandfather's arm around her more than the world needed one more old man in a room watching justice get done. A man's got to know which room he belongs in. I belonged on the stairs. I didn't walk away from the wreckage to lick my wounds. I've never in my life abandoned a job because it got hard, and I wasn't about to start at 77. A pressman who opens up a jam machine doesn't leave the guard hanging off. He looks at what broke and he sets it right, better than before. And there was plenty to set right, because bringing my daughter down was never the point. It was only the moment the bleeding stops. The healing came after, and the healing was the real work. The first thing to fall was the thing she'd built to make me fall, the conservatorship. Against my evaluation, the honest specialists, the real one, certifying that Jean Halloran was fully competent. And against the ugly picture of how her petition had been built, with a compliant doctor and a seated roomer and a forged signature, the thing died on the vine. No judge was going to look at that and see a declining old man in need of a guardian. They saw a sharp old man with a machine built to grind him, and the petition never had a breath of life in it once the truth was on the table. I stayed a free man, master of myself and my own affairs, and it was affirmed in writing, which is exactly the thing my daughter had spent 2 years and a forged signature trying to take from me. The money came back, most of it, the way it does when an honest banker and a patient investigator and a detective who's kept her records all pull the same direction. The big prize, the shop, the building, the press, the protected savings had never left my hands thanks to Ruth and never would. The cash she'd managed to bleed, the transfers and the shell company charges and the cruise, Lorene and the bank and the law, traced and clawed back, dollar by dollar, and what came back I put right where it belonged, which I'll come to. And here's a thing that let me sleep at night. Sturgis, it turned out, had run this kind of elder work before, and when one thread comes loose, the whole cloth starts to go. There were other families, other old people, other conservatorships that smelled wrong, and once Detective Pruitt started pulling, Sturgis answered for more than just me. Stopping the man who'd have done it again to somebody else's mother or father turned out to be part of what my patience bought. And that's the part I'm proudest of. I think about those other families sometimes. I never met most of them, but I know they existed, and I know some of them didn't have a Ruth who'd made them keep their name on the papers 15 years before, and didn't have a trade that had drilled patience into their hands, and didn't have a laptop nobody thought to take away. Some of them ended up in the room with the garden in the brochure, paying for their own disappearance out of their own accounts, sure right to the end that it was love. And when I think of them, I don't feel triumph about my own escape. I feel the duty of it. The duty to spend the escape on them, on the next ones, on the old people who'll be marked out tomorrow by some other Sharon, with some other warm smile and some other paper to sign. That's what the fund is for, but I'll get to that. First, I have to finish telling you what became of my daughter. Dr. Pate answered to the medical board for a note he'd signed, without a real examination, and I don't imagine he'll sign many more like it. And there was the press, and the shop with my name on the window. When it was all over, I went down to the shop, and I stood in front of the good Heidelberg and the old Platen I'd learned on, the machines my daughter had called junk to be hauled off, and I ran a clean proof, just to feel it, just one sheet, and it came off crisp and true the way it had for 50 years. The ink laying down black and even, indifferent to everything that had happened, doing its one honest job. And I thought that press was the most like Ruth of anything I owned. Plain, honest, patient, running true and quiet, while the world around it lost its mind. They tried to sell you for scrap, I thought, watching it. And here you are, still printing the truth. Same as me. Same as her. I ran a few more sheets than I needed to, that day, just to stand there in the sound of it. There's no sound in the world like a press finding its rhythm. The pull, the kiss of Platen to paper, the release, over and over, steady as a heartbeat. And I'd been listening to that heartbeat for 60 years, and it had never once lied to me. My daughter had called it a little machine. She'd have hauled it off for scrap and never heard what it was saying. And what it was saying, that afternoon, in the empty shop with the March light coming through the front window and gilding the gold leaf name I'd laid on the glass with my own hands 50 years before, was the only thing it had ever said, the thing it would go on saying long after I was gone, in a girl's hands instead of mine. True, 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 true. You can cancel a man's cards, I thought, watching it run. You can't cancel the man. And you surely can't cancel this. The law took its time with my daughter, the way the law does. Slow, maddening, so slow that more than once I wondered whether I'd live to see the end of it. But the wheels grind all the way down, even when they grind slow, and when they finish, they don't run backward. The case against Sharon was as clean as they come, Detective Pruitt told me, and she'd seen plenty, which is what happens when the victim kept his name on the papers, kept his money out of reach, kept the records, and the guilty party was foolish enough to put her own contempt in writing and hand the old man, in her own words, the very confession he needed. There wasn't much of a fight in the end. Her lawyers looked at the mountain, the traced money, the shell company, the forgery, the conservatorship scheme, her own texts calling me a scammer's victim to cover herself, and did the only sensible thing. Sharon answered for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, for theft, for fraud, for forgery. Sturgis answered for his part. Wade, who'd been the passenger and not the driver, answered in his own smaller way, and mostly by telling the truth about her at last. There were convictions and there was restitution, and I won't walk you through every technicality because the procedure was never the point. I went to the hearing. I sat in the back, on a hard bench, in the good suit, and I watched the last chapter of my daughter's long-reaching end, in a few flat sentences from a judge who'd seen 1,000 Sharons and had run out of patience for all of them. She didn't rage the way she'd raged for that 1 second in my kitchen when the mask came off. She sat there smaller than I'd ever seen her, in a suit that didn't seem to fit anymore, and for the first time in her life, she had no smile that worked and nothing to say. She didn't turn around to look at me. I honestly don't know what I'd have done if she had, and on that hard bench I felt no triumph, only a tiredness as old as the world, because I was watching a whole life catch up to a person all at once, and no man, not even a wronged one, is glad to see that land on the face of his own child. Sharon's marriage did not survive it. I don't know of any marriage that survives one spouse taking the fall and the other testifying to save himself. Inside a year, Wade was gone, and Sharon was left alone with what she'd done in a house that had gotten very quiet. And I know something about a house that's gotten very quiet, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, not even her. She came to me eventually, not with the easy tears, but ashamed, unable to meet my eye, and asked whether I could ever forgive her. And I'll tell you what I told her, because it's true. And because I don't want you thinking this ends with a hard old man turned to stone. I told her yes. I told her that I forgave her, that I laid the weight of it down for my own sake as much as hers, because I'm old, and I've buried the only person I'd carry that kind of weight for, and I won't spend what's left of my life dragging it around for Sharon. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and I told her that too. I forgave her freely. I will never trust her again, not with a dollar, not with a signature, not with a key to anything I love. That door is shut, and she shut it herself, at my kitchen table, the day she decided her own father was a resource to be managed. She has my forgiveness, if she wants it. She does not have my trust. She spent that to the last cent, and it's the one account that can't be clawed back. But there was a member of my daughter's household I wasn't finished with, not by a long way, and she was the one who mattered most. There was Josie. When the dust settled and I sat down with Harriet to decide how everything would be arranged, the shop, the building, the money, the name, I did it with her reading me every line out loud, which is exactly the way a thing like that ought to be done, and the exact opposite of how my daughter had tried to make me do it. And the decisions weren't hard, because for the first time in 2 years, I knew precisely who was who. Sharon would never see a dollar of what she'd tried to steal, not directly and not through anyone else, and the papers were written so that it couldn't happen, ironclad, no gap for another Sturgis to work a finger into. But I didn't punish Josie for her mother's sins, and I didn't punish Michael, who'd never wanted a nickel of it and had proven exactly by not wanting it that he deserved every bit. I provided for Michael, my steady son, and the most important thing I gave him back wasn't money. It was the years. It was his father, and the truth about who had kept us apart, and whatever time the two of us have left. Michael and I talk every week now, and he comes when he can, and the 2 years that were stolen from us are the one thing in this whole story that even the law can't return, and I grieve them, and I've stopped resenting them, because grieving what's gone and holding tight to what's left is the only way I know to be an old man without going bitter. And then there was the shop, and the press, and the name on the window. Josie came to live with me. It happened slowly, naturally, first a few nights when her mother's house got to be too much, then weekends, then it was simply home, with what blessing her mother could manage. Because even in her disgrace, Sharon had the wit to see that her daughter needed what I could give, and she, in that season, could not. And Josie came back to the bench, not the way she had as a little girl, on a milk crate on Saturdays, for fun. She came as an apprentice, in earnest, with the loop to her eye and my tools in her hands and the same stubborn focus I'd watched in her grandmother across a kitchen table 60 years ago. And I taught her, Lord, the joy of teaching her, how to set a line clean and lock a forme so tight it'll never spring, how to feel a press about to misbehave, how to mix an ink to match anything on God's earth, how to hold a whole town's words in your hands and never, ever betray the trust of the people who gave them to you. She has the hands, Josie. She has the patience. She has the thing you can't teach, the thing her grandmother had and my son had, the thing that skipped a generation and landed clean and whole in this girl who'd held herself together alone on a landing while her family came apart. I'll give you one afternoon at the bench because it's the one I'd keep if I could keep only one. She was locking up a formal, setting the type tight in the metal frame with the little wooden blocks and the coins you tighten to hold it all. And she was rushing it, the way the young rush everything, forcing the coins hard because harder felt like better. And I stopped her hand. Josie, I said, you feel that? How it's fighting you. A forme you force will spring on you on the press. One letter pops loose under pressure, and the whole line pies and your job's ruined, and you don't even know why. You don't win by squeezing harder. You seat every piece first, gentle, till it's true, and then you snug it up, and then it holds anything. Force springs it, patience locks it. And she slowed down, and she seated it, piece by piece, feeling it the way I'd taught her, and she snugged it up true, and she lifted the whole locked for me in one hand and gave it a shake, and not a letter moved. And she looked at me with her grandmother's eyes and said, "It's like what you did with Mom, isn't it? You didn't squeeze. You waited till it was all seated, and then it held." And I had to turn away and fuss with an ink can a minute, because the child had reached in and said the truest thing about the whole affair, better than I'd said it in 100 pages, standing at a bench with ink on her hands. Force springs it, patience locks it. She learned that at 17. It took me 77 years and everything I had. I had Harriet write it down in black and white. The shop, the name, the building, the presses, the century-old wood type you can't buy at any price. All of it would go to Josie. Not to someone who'd sell it for scrap for the fun of it, but to a girl who'd keep the type cases clean and the press wound and would learn, one job at a time, why it takes a person a whole life to build something that isn't for sale at any price. Halloran Press would have another Halloran bent over the stone, because Josie, when she was old enough to choose the name she'd put on her own work, chose her grandmother's and mine, not her father's. And I'm not going to try to tell you what that choice did to me, because there aren't words said in any font I own for it. The name would stay. The trade would stay. The hands I'd been afraid I was the last to hold would stay, younger than mine, bent over the same stone in the same shop on the same square, printing the truth plain for a town to read, long after my own hands are still. They wanted to sell it all for scrap and file me away in a home on my own dime. Instead, the shop stays open, my name stays on the window, and there's a 16-year-old at the bench with her grandmother's hands. That's the final tally. On the things that matter, my daughter took nothing at all. That left the question of the money that came back and what to do with it. And here I have to tell you about Ruth one more time, because what I did for her, and in her name. I didn't need it. I'm 77, the shop is mine, the house is mine, my wants are few and my days are simple. I could have put it back in the bank to sit and do nothing, but it had been stolen under a very particular kind of cruelty. The cruelty of somebody who targets an old person exactly when he's most alone and most broken, and uses the word protection and the word family and the word love as the pry bar. And it seemed to me that money ought to go back to fighting that exact cruelty. So, with Harriet, I set up a foundation, and I named it for my wife, the Ruth Halloran Fund. The fund does one thing, but it does it with all the stubbornness Ruth used to put into those Sunday night books. It helps older people who are being robbed by the very family appointed to protect them. It pays for lawyers like Harriet and accountants like Dana and investigators like Marv for old folks who can't afford them. The ones who are alone and grieving and being managed by someone with a plan and a gentle voice. It fights conservatorship petitions filed in bad faith. The ones that aren't about protecting anybody but about seizing everything. And it helps competent old people prove they're competent, which is the most humiliating thing that can be asked of a person, to have to prove your own mind is your own. And it teaches Ruth's rule, plain and hard, the rule of the finger tapping the table, to anyone who will listen. Keep your name on the papers. Be as generous with your children as your heart tells you, but don't hand over control while you're alive and in your right mind. And if you're a widow or a widower, keep your own eyes on your own money, because the day you go blind to it is the day somebody starts to count it. And I added one lesson of my own, the printer's lesson. Keep the record. Keep your own copy of everything. Whoever controls the paper controls the story. So, don't ever let somebody else be the only one holding your paper. And I'll tell you the thing I've come to understand about why so many of us old ones fall for it, because it might do somebody some good to hear it. It isn't that we're stupid, it's that we're lonely and tired, and at a certain point, somebody shows up with a warm smile and the word help and the word family. And after months of a silent house, that word is so warm, you'll hold your hands out to it without checking where the fire's coming from. And there's worse. There's the shame. Because the moment you start to suspect that the person who says they love you is robbing you, the first thing you feel isn't anger, it's shame. Shame at thinking such an ugly thing about your own child. And the shame seals your mouth. It makes you say, I must be wrong. I must be getting suspicious in my old age. I can't think that about my own daughter. And while you sit there ashamed of your own suspicion, they work. The Ruth Halloran Fund exists to tell those old people one thing, before it's too late. Don't be ashamed to look. Looking isn't a betrayal of the people you love. Real love holds up under a clear eye. Only a swindle needs you to keep your eyes shut. That's the whole lesson, and it's the one I nearly learned too late. And it's Ruth's, and now it goes out under her name to anyone who'll take it. Let me tell you about one man, because 1,000 numbers don't say what one man says. His name was Harold. That's not his real name. And he was 80, a retired school teacher. And his son and daughter-in-law were bleeding him exactly the way I'd been bled. The concern, the let us handle it, the canceled cards. The papers slid across the table to sign without reading. The comments about his memory planted carefully in front of others. And finally a petition to have him declared incompetent. Harold came to us shaking, half convinced he really was losing his mind, because they'd told him he was slipping so many times, so gently, that he'd started to believe it. And that, believe me, is the cruelest part of all, convincing a sound man he's lost his wits. The fund put Harriet beside him, and a real doctor, and inside a few months the petition collapsed and his money came home. But that's not the part I want to leave you with. The part I want to leave you with is Harold's face on the day a judge dismissed the petition, and a man with authority told him, in front of everyone, that he was fully competent, that he wasn't slipping, that he never had been. I have never seen relief like it on a human face. He looked like a man handed back not his money, but himself. And I stood in the back of that room and thought of Ruth, and I thought, there, that's what the money was for. It was never mine. It was hers. And that's what she does with it now. Harold came back to us a few months later, steadier, and asked whether he could help, as a volunteer, sitting in on the first meetings with other frightened old people. Because, he said, and he was right, a scared old person who's been half convinced he's losing his mind will believe you're not crazy faster from another old person who's been through it than from all the lawyers in the world. He comes in every week now, and he looks those old folks in the eye and says the simplest, most powerful thing there is, I believe you, and you're not alone. I think sometimes that's the real inheritance Ruth left. Not the money clawed back, not the lawyers paid, but a room where a frightened old person can hear another old person say, I believe you, you're not alone. It's all I'd have wanted to hear in the worst of those months when I was starting to suspect the truth and was ashamed to suspect it. There was nobody to say it to me then. Now, because of Ruth, there's somebody to say it to the next one. And in the end, I went back to the bench. That's the simple part, and the best. I went back to the press and the type and the stone, back to the clean smell of ink and the good weight of a composing stick in my hand. I took work again. Not much at my age, but the good jobs, the fine ones, the letterpress a machine can't fake, the wedding invitations and the memorial cards and the fine additions that people want made by a human hand. And I began to teach, not just Josie, but others, kids sent over from the high school, from a program for young people who don't fit the ordinary molds, kids with restless hands and nobody left with the time to teach them a slow and patient craft in a world that's in a hurry about everything. And somebody asked me once why I bothered, at my age, after everything. There was one boy the school sent over, 14, all elbows and attitude, the kind of kid teachers had mostly given up on, who came in the first day sure he was too smart and too cool for a room full of old iron and dead men's type. He knocked a case of type on the floor his second week, thousands of pieces of sorts, hours of work to distribute back. Whether by accident or to see what I'd do, I never knew. And he braced for me to yell, the way he'd clearly been yelled at his whole life, and he had that hard, flat, ready-for-it look. And I didn't yell. I got down on my old knees beside him and I said, well, I did the exact same thing at 14, and old Amos smacked me so hard I saw stars, and it didn't put one letter back in the case. So, we're gonna do the thing that does. On your knees, I'll show you how to sort them. It's slow. That's the whole point of it. And we sorted type off the floor together for 2 hours, and somewhere in that second hour, the hard look came off his face. Because I think it was maybe the first time in his life an adult had watched him break something and responded by kneeling down next to him. That boy comes in on his own now, after school some days, has ink under his nails, sets a clean line. And somebody asked me once why I bothered, at my age, after everything. And I told them the truest thing I know. I said, a trade is a way of telling a person they're worth handing something to. A man once tried to convince me I was a building to be sold, a business to be liquidated, an old fool to be filed away on his own dime. Teaching is my answer to that man, to that woman. Every kid I teach to pull a clean impression off an old press is me saying, no. He wasn't a building. He wasn't a resource. He was a life, and lives get handed on, not liquidated. That's the thing the people who only count what a thing is worth never understand. The things that are actually worth anything don't have a price. They have heirs. Let me tell you about one Sunday this past year, because it's the answer to that other Sunday, the one with the nice dishes set out to carve me up. It was a dinner again, at my house, at my table. But the table was different. Michael was there, flown in, laughing with his head thrown back exactly the way his mother used to. Josie was there, 16 turned 17 now, with ink already worked into the creases of her hands, telling her Uncle Michael about a tricky form she'd locked up that week that hadn't sprung a hair. And the two of them, the engineer and the apprentice printer, bent over a napkin drawing out how a press bed carries the pressure even, and I had to get up and go stand on the back porch a minute, the one where Ruth used to talk to her plants, because some kinds of happiness are too big to sit still at a table with. There was an empty chair. I didn't set it on purpose, and it isn't some grand gesture. It's just that when you lay a table for family, your hands count the old number, and there's one chair too many, and that chair is Sharon's, and Sharon isn't there and won't be. And I'll tell you something honest about that empty chair. Because I've looked at it a good deal, I don't feel hatred when I look at it. Hatred is heavy, and I'm old, and I've buried the only person I'd carry that kind of weight for. And I won't spend the years I've got left dragging one around for my daughter. But there's no place set for her either. And here's the thing I learned. The thing it took me 77 years and a robbery at my own table to understand all the way down. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. People confuse them because they sit side by side, but they run on different wheels. I can forgive a person. I can set the weight down. I can even wish, somewhere far underneath, that she finds her way to being better than she's been. And at the very same time, never trust her again. Never seat her at my table again. Never hand her a single key to a single thing I love. Forgiveness is something you do to set yourself free. Trust is something a person earns or spends. And once it's spent the way Sharon spent hers, a daughter canceling her grieving father's cards to rob him and calling it protection, it doesn't come back at any price. Sharon has my forgiveness, if she ever wants it. She does not have my trust. That went at this table, the day she decided her father was a resource. And it isn't coming back, and I've made my peace with that. There's one thing about that empty chair I want to say for Josie, because someday she may see this told. And she deserves the truth, said with care. Sharon is her mother, and will always be her mother, and I have never said one word to Josie to turn her against her. I did the exact opposite of what was done to Michael and me. I did not poison the child's ear against anyone. I told Josie only the plain truth of what happened, when she was old enough to bear it, and then I left her free to love her mother as much as her own heart needs to, without shame, without me sitting in judgment of it. Because a child has the right to love a parent even when the parent hasn't earned it. And to take that right away would be to do to Josie the very thing that was done to us. The empty chair isn't a rebuke aimed at Josie. It's just the plain fact of something that broke. And in this house, we don't hide the broken things anymore. Not since that hard March light. We set them out where everyone can see, and then we go on living. If Sharon ever becomes a person you can hand a key to again, Josie will have my blessing to hand her one. But not at this table, and not with papers in her hand. That lesson I paid too much for to forget. And I think about fathers and children, and the ones you're given versus the ones who show up, sitting there looking at that empty chair. I spent years aching because my son, Michael, didn't want my shop, my name, my trade, and warming myself at the daughter and son-in-law who seemed so ready to step in close. And I had it exactly backwards. The son who went his own way loved me enough to fly home and take apart the machine that was eating me alive. The daughter who wanted my life wanted it only to sell it off for parts. It isn't the one who wants your inheritance who loves you. It's the one who'd treat it the way you treated it. I learned that almost too late, and I carry the almost like a splinter under a nail. But almost too late means in time, and in time is all a man can ask for. So, let me tell you what this whole thing taught me, from the seat of an old printer who thought he'd already learned everything a man needs to know and found himself, at 74, back at school with grief and betrayal for teachers. I learned that the loudest person in a room is almost never the one holding the type. My daughter was smooth and certain and warm when it suited her, and she filled every room with her sureness that she'd already won, and she had nothing. I was quiet and small and beaten-looking and seemed to have nothing, and I held everything. Because a woman 2 years dead had made me keep my name on the papers. Don't let the noise fool you. Look at who holds the paper. Always look at who holds the paper. I learned that patience isn't weakness, even though it wears the same coat. And that's exactly why impatient people mistake it for weakness and throw themselves onto it and break their teeth. I waited months playing the confused old man, swallowing my pride at every meal, feeding a folder in the next room. Not because I was weak, because the patience of the pressman is the sharpest tool there is. It opens what force can't. Force a tight formo and you spring it and ruin the whole job. Wait and feel it, and let every piece seat itself, and you can lock up anything. They thought I waited because I couldn't act. I waited because I knew exactly when to, and not 1 second before. I learned that the record is the only thing that outlives the argument. My daughter told a story, a good one, a warm one, about a scammer and a slipping old man. And she told it to everyone, and everyone believed it, and it still lost, the instant the record was laid on the table beside it. Stories are loud and the record is quiet, but the record wins every time it's allowed in the room. That's the whole of my trade in one line, and it turned out to be the whole of my life. You can't unprint the truth. Once it's set clean and pulled plain, where everyone can read it, no story stands against it. And I learned the difference between what a thing is worth and what a thing is. My daughter looked at my shop and saw a number. She looked at my presses and saw scrap. She looked at 50 years of holding a town's words in my hands and saw a building on a fashionable square. She looked at me and saw a resource to be managed. She spent her whole life counting what things were worth, and she ended with nothing, because a person who only counts what things are worth never owns anything that's actually worth anything. The things that count don't have a price. They have a name on a window and a girl with the right hands to carry it, and a press that keeps printing true while the world loses its mind. You can cancel a man's cards. You can't cancel the man. You told me scammers were everywhere at my age, Sharon, and you were right. There was one, and I only had the address wrong. Keep your name on the papers. That's the whole of it. That's what a woman told a printer at a kitchen table 15 years ago, tapping her finger on the wood. And it's the truest line I ever helped set. And I learned at the very last the hardest thing to say out loud, and it's this. Being underestimated is a strength if you've got the patience to bear the shame of it. For months I let my daughter believe I was finished. I swallowed the pats on the hand, the "Yes, Dad, you're right," the chuckling to visitors about my memory. A stranger left believing I was a hollow old fool. Every day a small death of my pride. And every one of those small deaths was another brick in the wall that stopped her, because the more helpless she believed me, the more careless she got. And the more careless she got, the more plainly she showed herself. A man who needs to be respected every minute could never lay this kind of trap. He has to be able to bear being small in the eyes of the ones who underestimate him, knowing inside himself exactly who he is. And I knew who I was. I was the ink-stained kid the fine men figured for a nobody. I was the man a grieving mother trusted with the last of her dead son's handwriting. I was the husband a sharp woman loved for 51 years and protected from the grave. Not one of my daughter's little laughs could take a single one of those things from me. They knew they were dealing with an old man. They never once bothered to find out which one the Form A held, the way it always holds when it's locked up, honest. Ruth, you were right about all of it. About her, about them, about the children, about that one small stubborn thing you made me do at this table with your finger on the wood. I kept my name on the papers, my love. I kept it to the end, and it held everything. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry, whether I hate her, and the honest answer, the one that surprises them, is no. What I feel mostly is grateful, and I know how strange that sounds, a man grateful at the end of a story about being robbed by his own child. But here's the arithmetic of it. I nearly lost the shop, and I didn't. I nearly lost my name, and it's still on the window, and it'll stay there in a girl's hands after I'm gone. I nearly lost my son to a liar's whisper, and I got him back, and we've got whatever years are left. And I got to find out, while I could still do something about it, exactly who loved me and who only wanted what I'd built. Most men never learn that until they're past being able to act on it. I learned it in time, robbed and lied about, and underestimated by everyone at that table. And still, somehow, the luckiest old man I know. That's Ruth's doing too. She always could find the one line in the ledger that came out in our favor, no matter how bad the year. She found it one last time, from 2 years under the ground, and the line read, "His name is still on the papers." And because of that, so is everything else. The shop, the name, the boy, the girl at the bench, all of it. If you've come this far with me, and if there's an old person in your life, or if the old person is you, take the one thing that matters out of all of this. The kindness that can't be refused, the gift with a string sewn inside it, the help that always seems to come holding a paper for you to sign. Look at it hard. Most of the time it's just kindness, and thank God for that. But sometimes it's a cage with a softer voice. And the only way to tell the difference is to keep your eyes open, and your name on the papers, and your own hand steady on the pen until you've read every line yourself. Trust the people who beg you to read. Be careful of the ones who tell you not to trouble your eyes. It's the simplest thing I know, and it saved my life, and I learned it from a woman who did the books at a kitchen table and loved an ink-stained printer for 51 years. Thank you for staying to the end. Go check your papers. And if you can, go sit an hour with somebody old and alone, not with anything to sign, just to sit and listen. Because loneliness is the door people like my daughter come through, and sometimes the only lock you need is somebody who shows up at the door for the right reason. And if you hold somebody tonight, let it be one of the ones who'd hold the door for you in the cold, not one who'd set the good dishes to carve you up. And if you're the old one, if you're the one being managed and protected and gently walked toward the edge, hear this from a man who was right where you are and came back. You are not slipping just because somebody keeps telling you that you are. You are not a fool for having trusted. And it is not a betrayal of your children to keep your own eyes open. Look at your own money. Keep your own copy of your own papers. If somebody tells you not to trouble your eyes, that's the moment to trouble them most of all. And if what you find is nothing, if it's just love, plain honest love, the way it is for most families most of the time, then thank God on your knees, because that's the richest thing there is, and go on trusting them with a clear heart. But look, looking cost you nothing, and not looking costs more old people more than you'll ever read about. I'm living proof a man can be 77 and grieving and underestimated by everyone and still not finished. Not while his name's on the papers, not while he's still the one holding the type. They canceled all my cards to keep me safe and swore the thieves were strangers at the gate. They cast me as the fool, the scammed, the waif, and never thought the old man stayed up late. I set my life in metal, line by line. I printed a whole town its truth for years. So when they wrote their story, soft and fine, I only had to read it back, through tears. Ruth at the table, finger on the wood. Keep your name on the papers, Jean. You knew, 2 years beneath the ground, and still you stood. The wall, the key, the lock that held me through. The press runs true behind the lettered glass, where no one sells it, and the ink stays black. There's ink beneath a girl's nails now, my last and truest line, the name that won't sign back. He's no thief who sleeps beneath a roof, nor he who shouts. The owner's the one with his name, and the patience, and the proof. Time keeps the ledger straight and squares the old accounts. To me, it gave the quiet. To her, the harvest of her truth.